Pledge of allegiance. Right, ready to begin.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
At this point in the agenda, we open it up to public comment. If there's anybody who would like to address the board on an item that's not already on the agenda, now would be the time to do that. Anybody in the audience interested in here for that? Seeing the public comment in person. Did we receive any written comment?
We didn't.
No written comment. I will close the public comment portion of the agenda. Item 3, opportunity for the board to review, to adopt the agenda. Do the board members interested in changing anything on the agenda?
Move approval of the agenda.
Second.
Right, so we'll keep the agenda as is. And move on to professional achievements, awards, anniversaries, and staff acknowledgements. Good morning.
Good morning, President Tristan and directors. Nice to see you this morning. And as I do on a monthly basis, I would like to acknowledge one staff this month for a work anniversary, and that would be Matt Nitz of the Operations Department. Matt is an Operator 3, and 10 years, Matt. That's a good achievement. So thank you very much. We appreciate your service.
Anything else?
That is all for now. Thank
Okay. Next item is our consent agenda. I did get a note from staff that they wanted to have us pull in the minutes to address that separately, so we'll move that right after the consent agenda and address that. Is there anything else the board would like to pull from the consent agenda? Hearing none, I'll take a motion to approve items 2 and 3.
Second.
Great. Did we get the motion and second?
Motion by Director Cox, second by Director.
Okay. Any public comment? Seeing none, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. So regarding the minutes, I believe the issue was a correction in the minutes for the board representation from Alpine Springs Water District. And so the minutes that were in the board packet included the former board member. They just need to be updated with our new representative from Alpine Springs. Was that it?
That is correct.
Okay. So with that amendment, make a motion to approve the minutes. Any other items on the minutes?
Move to approve as amended.
Second.
Motion and a second. Any comment? Hearing none. All in favor of approving the minutes?
Aye.
Aye. Minutes approved. Okay, we'll get on to the regular agenda. Item 1, review possible action on land use policy on update from the ad hoc committee and legal counsel.
So the ad hoc committee held a meeting discussing some of the bullet points that are attached in the board packet as it relates to a land use. This point, I'll turn it over to Deanne, who's part of the land use ad hoc. We also have Josh here to give a presentation on Surplus Land Act, some of the next steps we would need to do to surplus land and dispose of it in some fashion. So with that, I'll turn it over to Director Wilkins. And Lucas, if you can pull up that Google overlay, yeah, I can talk to it.
Sure. Yeah, so Dale and I were appointed to the ad hoc committee to continue to discuss the possibility of TTSA surplusing property. So we've met a few times. off and on over the past 6 months. I'll invite you, Dale, to jump in and kind of correct me on anything that you kind of see differently than I'm presenting. We had some good discussions with staff. We kind of looked more closely at the land holdings that TTSA has. And, at one point we've been discussing developing a policy, for the board of directors to consider and adopt. I think one of the things that Dale and I wanted to suggest to the board is that potentially rather than a detailed policy, we instead adopt guiding principles and see if we can collectively agree on guiding principles that we would consider when thinking about surplusing land, and maybe have it be a little more flexible and a little less rigid than a fully baked policy. So Richard and Jason were the primary, and Liz were the primary staff members we've been working with on this. They've done a pretty good job, in my opinion, of summarizing the different, I'll call it bullet points, kind of guiding principles, at least from my perspective, that Dale and I talked about. So the map that's up on the screen, there's a lot of colors on there. As we all know, TTSA owns a lot of land, 930 acres, 950 acres, something like that. And, historically, we have not been very receptive to selling any of that land. And I think for good reason. Some of our treatment processes and chemicals that we used to have here on site were much more, had much greater potential for, kind of catastrophic consequences if we had leaks and whatnot. So having healthy setbacks from the plant, from a safety standpoint, I think historically was maybe more important than it is now with some of our changes in our disinfection primarily, and the fact that we're using, basically bleach for disinfection now instead of the chlorine, higher strength chlorine that we used to use. With that said, I think Dale and I felt like if we're going to consider surplusing land, let's identify just a portion of TTSA's holdings that we would place into consideration for that. And our thought was the land that on this exhibit is south of Georgia Drive, and it's not obvious to. Georgia Drive is the white line that's the not straight line. It kind of works its way across the screen. And then over to the right, you see there's like two parallel white lines that lead down towards the end of the airport runway. So, I think when you look at the total acreage there, it's in the range of 150 acres plus or minus. And then what you see in green on that map is the property we're in the process of acquiring from the airport district. I think later today we're, finalizing some actions by the board to move that property into TTSA ownership. The stuff that's highlighted in blue is property that we currently own that we would be transferring to the airport district. So I think, Dale and my thought was, that area that's south of Georgia Drive and to in this screen left or west of the road that leads down to Myers Creek Dam, which is kind of those two white lines that are near the end of the airport runway, that would be the chunk of land we should be contemplating doing surplus on. Now, if we're going to do that, one of the provisions that we were suggesting as a guiding principle is that any land that we would consider surplusing should be land that's not identified for future TTSA use. And other board members may recall that some of that land in that area was identified as a I'll call it a backup future disposal field. Now through the process of this committee work, we've had conversations with staff, and what we're hearing from staff is that they believe in the not too distant future we would, in all likelihood, be eliminating that as the location of a possible future disposal field, because there's the need for it is highly speculative, and there's other land on TTSA property that might be better locations for that. So I'd ask Richard or Jason to jump in if I'm misstating that.
You are not misstating that. That is correct. There's other opportunities for other areas to be utilized in the event that it ever needs to be utilized. And as far as the fate and transport study that we've been undertaking, and I'll let Jason's been more involved with it. I'll let him speak to the phosphorus removal that's taken place in the field and the projections and everything. So if you would, go
The
ahead.
initial study has kind of given us indications that if it's progressing at the same rate that it has for the last 45 years, we have 150 years of similar capacity. So we're not too concerned about that field here.
Right. So I just wanted to bring that up because, again, one of these guiding principles is that it should be land that's not identified for any future use. Historically, that has been identified for future use, but that looks like it's got a pretty decent likelihood of changing. So
What parcel is that on here?
Jason, could you have a cursor that you can?
Thank you, Scott.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it might be a little bit more to the east, but yeah.
And so we had a land use risk study that kind of created a polygon of area identified as potential surplus because it didn't impact future TTSA operations. And that area was not in that polygon, but you're saying that in all likelihood, given some changes in the fate and transport study, that we might update that drawing. And would there be a kind of relocation? Would some of the area that was identified as surplus land now identified as land that shouldn't be surplus, because that would be the location where we would likely locate future subsurface disposal?
I think the area that would probably be the highest likelihood of moving an SAT to is already identified in the risk assessment as reserved land for future use anyhow. It'd be adjacent to the existing SAT field going towards Tykert in my mindset. As you all know, Tykert's wrapping up mining operations there. They're just processing material they bring in elsewhere. They've already approached us about releasing the lease for the reclaimed property that's within the current lease with them. So those areas could easily come into play in the next couple of years.
Yeah. So then other stuff Dale and I talked about, we've got the land that is north of Jorger Drive. Basically, we own from Jorger Drive, the Truckee River, for a fairly long swath. And I think Dale and I had slightly different viewpoints on that. I think there's a portion of that land where it's floodplain of the Truckee River. There's some archaeological resources out there related to the historic ice industry here in Truckee, and also prehistoric areas where the Washoe tribe used to use that area quite heavily. So there's certain areas that don't really have a whole lot of potential for any kind of use because of environmental considerations. Dale and I talked about that property in terms of, well, should TTSA be as a public agency, be the long-term landowner to basically preserve that property? I think we could be. We also thought that we should be open if there were entities like the Truckee Donner Land Trust or other conservancy type organizations that would potentially want to buy that property. that we should be open to that as well. And then there's the land between Georgia Drive and what I'll call the environmentally sensitive land. So you see there's a long, like, green line on there. I believe, I don't think that it's like close to the Legacy Trail. I think the red line is the Legacy Trail. I think the green line is that's our TTSA sewer line. The TRI.
Yes.
So if we were contemplating, surplusing land in that area, we'd want to think about, would we want to surplus the land under the TRI or maintain ownership of it? Obviously, we would want to maintain an easement, for that piece of land where the TRI is and access to the TRI if we were to surplus anything in that area. I think our thought was, there's a lot of land on the south side of Georgia Drive, and for now, not entertain surplusing land, between Georgia Drive and the river, because there's plenty of other land on the other side of the road we could be contemplating first. I think in my mind, I was thinking if the possible exception to that could be if there was like recreation type interest in some of that land that's on the, between Georgia Drive and the river, that could be the one exception we would consider in terms of potentially surplusing some of that land. I think Dale's opinion was, and I don't want to speak for you, Dale, was that
I'm listening.
Was that we should probably not, that we should potentially not even consider recreation uses or developed recreation on that side, and we should only be thinking about surplusing land on the south side of Georgia. So I'll let you jump in, Dale.
Well, when you talk about recreation has a broad prescription. It's one thing to have a ball field, but then along with ball field comes parking spaces, comes bleachers, comes lights, comes restrooms, it can be a compounding thing where all of a sudden recreation takes on a whole nother dimension, and what it needs to really be a viable recreation site. So I would be just a little bit hesitant at this point. My position on this, board members, is that, I call it the Dan Wilkins Legacy Trail because he did facilitate the Legacy Trail. It's a very important entity and a very important thing for the public to have, is that Legacy Trail, and to keep a buffer zone between the trail, the river, and the road, so that it stays pristine, it stays nature-like. I think that we have enough other land that we could make available and either hopefully have Truckee Tahoe Land Trust come in and want to buy up some of this property. But I would not be opposed to recreation on that site, kind of next to TSD, but it would have to come with limitations, because, like I say, the recreation can take on a life of its own, and it might materialize into something that would be negative to what I would feel would be our mission. So, Dan, you've covered it all very well. I think that we're on the right track here. Hopefully today and the next week or so, we can get this land exchange with the airport done, and then we can sit back and really wrap our arms around what we're dealing with what we have available.
Right. So, yeah, thanks, Dale. So just a couple of other comments, and then I'll stop. So there was the information in the land package. I think some of the key deal points that Dale and I wanted to recommend to the board is that any sale of land should be at fair market value, or if there were or market lease rates if there were going to be some kind of a lease arrangement. So it's not, donating property. It's trying to convert land into cash that can be used to fund agency activities. So I think that was one key piece. I think we felt that if there were member agencies interested in purchasing land, we should make every effort to accommodate that. That we should be, and in the deal points, it talks about that we would only deal with other public entities. One question in my mind is, would we modify that to public entities or infrastructure providers? There's companies like Southwest Gas, AT&T, Altice, who are their private sector infrastructure providers. And I don't have any knowledge that any folks like that are looking for land to, set up, maintenance yards, but that could be the one exception in my mind to public entities that we might consider. I think one of the reasons we were suggesting limiting it to public entities is we had concern that if you open it up to private entities as well, we could be dealing with a whole lot of proposals in a very short time frame on people coming to us with any number of proposals to do development out here. I don't think that's really what we think is appropriate. But if there's other public agencies that have needs for that are beneficial to the community and they're able to pay fair market value for land, I think that kind of keeps the basket kind of small in terms of prospective buyers and probably creates some mutual benefit, between us being able to potentially get, turn land into cash, and then also helping other public agencies meet their needs. And then we also want to make sure that if there were to be land sold, that we don't inadvertently landlock other pieces of property behind it, because there's a lot of land between Georgia Drive and where the airport is, and if you sell the road frontage as an example and then landlock the stuff behind it, then that will devalue that land. So and then I won't go through all the other topics that are in here. We did have Josh was involved with a number of our meetings, and we can let him speak to kind of the process for surplusing property and Surplus Land Act. I think the simple version is if we're surplusing land to other public entities, it's a relatively simple process. I don't know if we had proposals from private companies who are also infrastructure providers, that might be a little more complicated, and Josh could probably educate us on that here as part of this conversation. Anything else, Dale?
Yeah, I've got a couple of things that I want to add. The first thing is we're in the infancy stage of all this, okay? This ad hoc committee that Dan and I are on, we're sitting back, we're trying to put together the points that would be beneficial to the region, to the members of our agency if they need land. But there's one thing that kind of sticks in the back of my mind, and you can help me out with this, Josh, is that we are a agency that is dedicated to treat waste and treat effluent. Our mission statement is to treat waste and treat effluent. If we are going to be going into the land business, we're going to be deviating from our mission statement, which I think that we should address very early on in this discussion. And I don't know that if we as an agency can wear two hats, be in the real estate business, selling surplus land and treating effluent, which is our main mission, whether or not we have to change our mission statement to be compliant with any of the state or federal laws. But, like I said, it's the infancy stage. As we progress, this is gonna heat up. And it's gonna heat up big time. And, I'm a little bit nervous at the amount of time that it's gonna take staff to be able to deal with this, that what we got coming down the pike. Now, Josh, I'd like to hear, if you could, talk to me about deviating from our mission statement and going into the real estate business.
It's essentially part of what I'm going to be talking about. I don't know if the board would like me to just get up and address the Surplus Land Act issues now as part of this discussion, or just answer.
I've got a couple comments and questions before we get there.
Okay, all right. So, I'm sorry.
Please, go ahead.
I mean, just directly to Director Cox's question. I believe that this is within your mission to the extent that you have surplus land. If you need to turn it into cash, for example, to carry out all of your upcoming improvement projects, that's a way to raise money. That connection to raising funds to do your work is the nexus really for making sure that it's within your purpose. And, just generally speaking, under the Agency Act, Section 140, you have very broad authority to deal with real property. And I believe that gives you the authority in the first place to actually go out, market property with the certain guardrails that we'll talk about more in a little while.
Do you have a question, Scott?
Yeah, so Dan, on the 150 acres that you mentioned early on, that includes the purple area, the green area, and then the parcel above it?
I think it's just the purple area and the parcel above it. I
Okay.
think the green area is in addition to that, but I'd ask Jason.
So yeah, if you're looking, so there's kind of a triangular shape that's just a little bit to the left of the bus barn, please.
The left
All the
of the
way
yellow area.
There, that probably about halfway across that APN 049040024, that kind of above the green, about halfway there is the 150. So even if we don't assume that we're repurposing that future disposal field, it's still 150 acres. The land use risk assessment identified a line kind of midpoint between that parcel that said you should probably go no further than this. And that primary reason for that was the future disposal field. But even without factoring that, it's still approximately.
So maybe more like a couple hundred acres.
Yeah, so what's the total if we include the disposal field that would be available for sale? Under these guiding principles, so to speak? It's like 300 acres.
Yeah, I think it's more like in the 200 range.
Yeah.
210, I thought we figured.
Okay.
Because right now we're excluding everything north of Jordan.
Okay. And the other thing I want to do, thanks ad hoc committee for putting this together. It's been a lot of work and appreciate your efforts. The one area that I'm a little concerned on is the five of us up here represent agencies. And I don't know how much outreach there's been to those agencies to get their input on it, because ultimately we want to make sure that it's a regional beneficial situation. Yeah, has there been any conversation or any thoughts about perhaps a 15, 20-minute presentation to the boards at these agencies to where we're at to get their input?
I could chime in on that, if I may, Dan. Like I said, this is in a very much of an infancy stage, and we could not really sit back and talk about land until we finish up this airport land exchange. As far as reaching out to the member agencies, personally, I have talked to my general manager, not the board, but the general manager of what I'm doing with the ad hoc committee and how we're moving along with the possibility of selling off surplus land. But until we get our arms around what we have as far as total land and because Missing Link has been the ongoing negotiations with the airport district, and it has a very critical effect on what we're talking about in general. So I've reached out to my general manager, but have not had any discussion at the board level because it just, we're not ready.
Yeah, and what I've been doing is a part of my monthly reports to the City PUD board is just advising them that this is a conversation that's underway here at GTSA, that, you know, we've historically not been open to surplusing land, that we are about reevaluating that. And I think as it relates to communication with other member agencies, I think if the other member agency, I'd almost probably defer that to, you know, the representatives of the other member agencies as to what level of, you know, communication or presentation you think would be appropriate.
I think it's critical that we do that because we do represent them, and we're at the infancy stage, and I think that we need to build into the process that we reach out to them and get their input at some point. I think that's a critical moment for us.
So I'd like to weigh in on that a bit. So we had our board meeting last week and through the little going with the membrane plan, the costs and all that stuff. At the same time, looking at what Alpine Springs has to do. And remember, a lot of our districts have two issues. One is infrastructure replacement, and the other is defensible space because we own land. And when I take those two things plus the things that are going to happen here with a new plan, if I was a ratepayer, I'd be mad as hell. We're not talking about $500 a year incremental here to do all these things. We're talking about thousands of dollars. $10 million to do 45 new homes in Alpine is not going to work. We told the developer the ratepayers won't approve it. We got to replace infrastructure. We got to spend several $100,000 on defensible space, and then we're going to have another 200. I don't know if you take the NPV, $280 million, the cost is going to be probably $500 million by the time you're done over the next 30 years.
320.
I hate to say it, if we don't find a way to raise money outside of just bond and don't do something with this land, then I think we've missed our fiduciary responsibility to the ratepayers. That's my personal opinion. That's where I'm going to push it hard. Even if we become a commercial, lease company on the side and pay our taxes and whatever else we got to do. If it lowers the rates, I think it's the right thing to do. And then we have to be responsible about how we do the land. But I can tell you, I got kids that live up here. They can't afford it if this stuff keeps going on like this. Then take your fire insurance that you have. We just got dropped in our development. So we're putting some pressure in the community here that is massive. The other thing I heard was, truckies trying to move all that commercial stuff that's near downtown, that's ugly, the tire stuff and the refinery, whatever thing that is, and move that out. This would be a perfect place for a lot of that stuff. Now, that's not infrastructure, that's not government, that's going to be private companies or private owners. We should consider that, in my opinion.
Wait a minute. Wait a minute.
Consider.
Putting an oil refinery out here on our property over the top.
Not a refinery, whatever that place
Aquifer is not part
I
of
get that.
my plan.
I say
I'll be
consider.
long gone. But I'll tell you what, the aquifer is a very, very important part of this region, and we've got to safeguard it. I don't even like those bulk tanks sitting out there at the
I
buck
agree.
barn.
I don't disagree.
And
I said
David
consider.
was
I'm
right.
not saying it all needs to come over here, but it should be considered.
Yeah, you're making a good point. You're making a good point. But, like I say, this is infancy stage. And you gotta crawl before you walk. And right now we're crawling, and let's just address the possibilities that we're gonna be looking at in the future. And, we're gonna have a lot of entities. We've got the Truckee Downer PUD with the purple here.
Yeah.
I think that's a great thing that I'd like to work with them. However, I don't want to see fueling facilities on this property. And Dan, you can chime in because you've had further discussions with Brian, I could imagine, with the town of Truckee.
Well, so we've got kind of 2 or 3 different topics here. Let me jump back to Scott's, question. So I think maybe the question for the board is, we've got this draft information that you're seeing for the first time, that's been developed for the ad hoc committee. And if there's a desire by individual member agencies to have presentations to their boards, probably the first question is whether we are comfortable, with the draft document we've got as being kind of close enough to start getting, feedback in a more formal way from member agencies. And if so, we could ask, staff to contact member agencies and see if they'd like to have us on their agenda, in the next month or 2.
And I think that would be excellent in the realm of transparency.
Okay, so what you're saying, Scott, and the rest of the directors, I know how you feel, Bert. So is it time? Is it the appropriate time for us to start addressing a dialogue with our constituents, our personal constituents?
Like I'm asking that question exactly. Is it time for us to say, okay, here's where we are. This is kind of our guiding lines. We want to present it to you so that you're aware of it. So if you have any things that you would like to add to it or anything that may be beneficial for the region as a whole or for them, that at least they get to be a part of that decision.
In a more focused way than just
Yeah.
commenting on a board agenda item. So,
Right.
So the agenda included something entitled TTSA Land Use Principles, and it's a nice job. So between the ad hoc committee and staff putting that together, we're hearing it's not entitled draft principles. It's not. I think it is a draft. Obviously, we have not adopted these
Right.
principles. At some point, we talked about adopting a formal policy, but now we're talking about maybe softening that a little bit. Just, I think at some point we would want to adopt by formal board action principles, and I'm hearing some feedback on some of these items here that we're still in the draft phase, and there's some comments. The current draft talks about, that it shall only be for public agencies, that member agencies get priority first. To Bert's comments, are we comfortable with that, or do we want to, broaden that to a wider audience? First of all, it should be drafted, and I do think that we should adopt this at some point. The item is agendized as possible action, but I don't know that we're at the point today where we're gonna, adopt this. It's a great framework.
I agree.
But it's, call it draft, and I think, sharing this is public information right now. It was in the agenda, getting this to our member agencies, I think is important so that we as board members can get feedback from our board and our, potentially constituents as well, to bring that feedback back here.
So,
But it would be nice to move forward with formally adopting this so that, we can start, if we so choose, start going to the next step.
okay, so what you're saying, Blake, is the next step would be for us as board members to start addressing what we're dealing with here, with our member agencies.
Yeah, I think I've been keeping my board up to date. I think it makes sense for you to potentially incorporate this, in your TTSA report at Olympic Valley and get feedback, so that you can share that back at this level. Ultimately, it's your vote, But, you know, I think it's a valid point that we should be getting feedback from our,
Yeah, and I think there's a couple things we could do to tune up the quality of our information, like the graphic we've been working with today. And I think we could do a better job with that in terms of, you know, highlighting the land that we're talking about being, that we would be contemplating, you know, for surplus. And I think there's some things we can do just to make the presentations a little cleaner.
So there is one thing that hasn't been mentioned here, and I don't want to get into this discussion, but there's no infrastructure. There's no sewer, there's no water, there's no electricity. So, like I say, we're at the infancy stage of this part of the discussion. Before you really can address talking with people like the Truckee Donner PUD, we have to have an infrastructure plan together. Because are we going to be the ones putting in the infrastructure? Are we going to let everybody else put in the infrastructure? How is this going to affect the value of the land? Obviously, the value of the land without infrastructure is far less than land that is ready for development. And so this is all stuff that I think that we ought to be able to address further as we get further down the road here. But right now, establishing a dialogue with with all of our constituents, I think is a good step in transparency. But we're a long way from breaking ground or having somebody come in and break ground because there's no infrastructure. Now, Blake, you mentioned that it's not that big a deal because you've got infrastructure up to where your operation is. But infrastructure can be very costly.
the current draft does include a statement about, making sure that, you know, we don't landlock and that there's road access easements to ensure access to properties that don't frontage the road. We could incorporate potentially, if it's appropriate land use thing, that, you know, infrastructure be extended to neighboring property and be sized to accommodate that. And so that's something that's not addressed directly in here. The road access is, but additional infrastructure is. I think that would be a good item in there and a good comment, Dale.
Yeah. And to Dale's point, you know, infrastructure is a significant issue in terms of, you know, potential future use of the land. I mean, there's one end of the spectrum where we could, you know, bring in, you know, basically develop a subdivision and a whole bunch of lots out there that would require a bunch of capital outlay by us on the front end, and then we'd have a bunch of, you know, well-packaged lots that would be much higher value than our land currently is. That kind of puts us into the subdivision business, right? As compared to recognizing that that's an important issue, and then having the expectation that landowners, you know, people that we would sell land to, would deal with the infrastructure, and then we would be smart about it on our side to make sure that it's adding value not only to the parcel that they're developing, but adjacent land, I think, which is what you were suggesting.
However, to chime into what Bert was saying, for us to sit back and surplus undeveloped land that doesn't have infrastructure, it has a different monetary value.
Yeah.
And for us to sit back and sell off undeveloped land or land that doesn't have infrastructure, we're not getting as much money out of our holdings as we could if it had sewer, water, and electricity.
Right.
And so we'll talk more about this at our committee level tomorrow.
I'm curious, you know, Bert's comment that, you know, it's part of our obligation to, you know, given the, you know, $15 to $20 million a year operating budget in a hundreds of $1 million in anticipated capital expenditures in the coming years to, find sources of revenue. Have we done any kind of back of the envelope, there was an appraisal done on the properties for this land exchange with the airport. Do we have some sense of what a per acre reasonable range of appraisal of this, and does this, does it really tip the chart? I mean, we're talking about, we sell 100 acres and we've made, maybe $5 million, and it really doesn't move the needle much, or is this actually, is this really one of the items in this draft principle says the intent of land sales is to offset the cost of current and future capital projects. I mean, if that's really the intent, I'm curious as to, what our projected revenue is for doing this, and is that really the intent, or is the intent that there's a recognition that in our area, land is limited, and really what we're trying to do is, take advantage of surplus land to provide a community benefit, as well as, there is the intent to bring in revenue, but I haven't seen any projected revenue streams, and I don't want to get all excited that, this is gonna fund our MBR system, when in fact it's gonna fund, a pump in the MBR system and not really do much at all to the overall pro forma. And so, as we come back to this item, perhaps after we talk to folks and maybe staff can do, numbers are tricky because people get attached to them, but I think that it's not unreasonable to be able to do some sort of rough range of projected estimates, and that's something that we could share with our member agencies, that, if the district were to sell off this property, that could bring in $10 million, $100 million, 500. I don't know what that number actually is, but again, I'd provide a range. I wouldn't try and, broad range, but some range that we could anticipate, because we're spending a bunch of time. It might be over pennies. So that would be helpful also to understand as we go back to our. But this is a great framework.
It's a good start.
It's a really good start. I really appreciate it. I think all of us were sympathetic to the Truckee Donner PUD and Brian Wright, who came last month. I think that we've had this 900 acres since the agency was formed, over 50 years ago. But times have changed. There is a demand out there. We've changed our practices such that perhaps having 900 acres of buffer land isn't essential to our operation. And so I think we're going down a good path. And I think we should, I think with these principles, getting some feedback from us, back to the ad hoc committee, going to our member agencies, getting potentially additional feedback on where they're at, and revisiting this again, hopefully in another month, we can get closer to hopefully adopting a policy that allows us to move slowly. There's not, the pressure's not on us, unless of course the money's so great that, and this is going to make a huge difference on what our ratepayers are going to be contributing. We may want to move quicker to offset that, to reduce the burden on our constituents, but otherwise, there's not a critical path to our operation, but I think we should move, methodically towards that. So, great job. The Surplus Land Act, I raised that question last month. And so Josh, maybe you could just address, and that could help us with this distinction between the current principles, which says public entities, versus the alternative concept of opening this up to the private sector. And so if you don't mind, maybe we could hear that.
Sure.
And eventually move on. Great.
Morning, everybody. So the Surplus Lands Act is a construct that's about 60 years old now. The state passed it originally to make sure when public agencies had surplus land and wanted to dispose of it, that they offered it originally, it was really for parks, open space. That was kind of the original purpose. In the last few years, with the increase in the interest in affordable housing in the state, the legislature did amend it in 2020 through a couple bills, made the process a lot more strict, required a lot more notice to a lot more entities, particularly in the affordable housing field. We did one recently where a client didn't have public purpose or anything, so it was just regular surplus land. They had to put it out to the open bid process. They literally sent 520 something notices out. That's how many interested affordable housing entities there are. So, it is a much bigger deal than it used to be. That said, particularly in the context of your current discussion and what the committee's proposing, the likelihood is you're going to fall within the exempt side of things, so that will make a big difference in terms of how much process you have to go through and what you have to do. So, backing up a little bit, one, I want to apologize. I was hoping to have a pretty slideshow for you today, but we had a special meeting emergency we need to throw together. So your consolation is you have this nice handout. Honestly, in a way, this has come up over time. It's probably good. Everybody has one of these, so it can be a good reference going forward. But, I just want to start. The Agency Act, it's your governing law. You have a statute right in Section 140. It provides you with, as I said earlier, pretty wide open authority to both buy and sell land, dispose of it. That said, the one thing that we need to always remember, there has to be a public purpose of the agency connected to any purchase or sale. I mean, you really can't be in the land speculation business, unfortunately. There's no way to set up a separate corporation. I mean, I suppose we could talk about a 501c3 that you could donate land to and do something like that. But, as a direct agency exercise, you have to have some purpose in declaring a parcel of land surplus and selling it to someone. And that's where the Surplus Land Act comes in. You also have to remember, whenever you're talking about surplus, you potentially have the guardrail CEQA that we have to deal with. Although generally speaking, unless you're surplusing it or some, say, cooperative project with another agency where there's a plan for that land that you're involved with, most likely you'll be able to exempt that from CEQA or just deem it not to be a project at that point. And apropos of this in 2023, when you did the surplus resolution for the TTA land exchange, you actually dealt with that issue. There's some language we put in there that protects you in terms of the CEQA issue. The other thing to remember is that you have to respect the gift of public funds prohibition, make sure when you're selling land that one, there is an agency purpose involved. And as we discussed earlier in response to Director Cox's question, generally speaking, if you're selling land to get money to fund your operations, activities, improvement projects, that's the nexus you need. That's sufficient to move forward. So moving into the Surplus Land Act, you've heard this before, but to reiterate, the purpose of it is basically when a public agency sells land, the legislature has deemed that you have some obligation to let folks involved in affordable housing, open space parks know that you have this land potentially for sale, and if they have some potential need for it, they can come in through a bidding process and make an offer to bid for that, purchase it. That said, the Act does provide for a number of exemptions. The big one that we've talked about quite frequently, of course, is the public-to-public exemptions. There's actually two. One is where you make a direct sale or transfer to another public agency for their use. The other one is the TTAD example, a land exchange. And then there are a couple of other exemptions that may apply. For example, one exemption, if some of your land has some pre-existing regulatory requirement on it that it can't be used for housing. I know in the past, some land was acquired from the federal government that may be restricted. If you can't put housing on it, that might exempt that land. The other big exemption is one you decide on essentially. If you feel in your operations that you need to have some buffer and the property can be restricted, say, for another public use, like a bus barn or another member agency's operations, you can restrict it just to those kinds of purposes as a way to buffer your operations from any kind of potential damage or issue with neighbors, say, in a residential development. Classic issue is always nuisance. It smells, things are going on, and people don't like it. And so you can essentially exempt yourself from that by putting those kinds of restrictions on. You know, the other thing that restriction could potentially be used for, the sensitive property on this side toward the river, you could protect that, but allow it, for example, to be sold or leased to an open space agency. So if you've got a local land trust that wants to operate the Legacy Trail and have open recreation out there, that's the kind of thing you could potentially do with that property. So, moving into the last part, the process, you've been through the process before. Where it starts is the board makes a decision, generally through a resolution, that you want to surplus land. You determine whether it's surplus land or exempt surplus land, and that's kind of a fork in the road. If it's exempt and you can find an exemption for it, you can claim that and move directly with whoever you want to dispose that property to. In this case, most likely another public agency. You can just move forward with that. The only thing you need to do is notify the California Community and Housing Department, make sure that they agree with the exemption. They've been pretty good about these things. We generally send them the paperwork. They take 2 or 3 weeks. They come back and say, yeah, you're right on. That's the end of that. It's exactly what happened with the TTAD example. And then if it is just regular surplus land, there is much more of a process. You have to get an appraisal of the land, which you should do anyway, regardless. Then you have to send out these notices I talked about earlier to affordable housing entities, to park entities, to open space entities. Give them 90 days to come back with a potential proposal to purchase the land. If somebody does respond, you have to enter into good faith negotiations with them for at least an additional 60 days. That said, you do have an obligation and the right both to require that an entity pay at least fair market value for that land. You don't have to accept any terms that are objectionable in a purchase and sale agreement, so you do maintain some control over it. And then at the end of that process, if no entity does respond, or somebody does respond but you can't negotiate, at that point it just becomes the process like an exempt surplus parcel where you have the opportunity to just go out and market it on some open market kind of terms. So with that, I think that's pretty much the nuts and bolts, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Go ahead, let's start with Bert.
What about leasing, developing ourselves and being a landlord?
That is a possibility. Surplus land, if it's for a lease of 15 years or longer, you actually have to deem it as surplus in order to enter into a long-term lease. If it's a shorter-term lease, you don't have to go through this process. But that is certainly a possibility. And you know, if the board decided you didn't want to dispose permanently of the land and fee, and you might want to take that land back someday and have control of it, that would be a good option.
This might be a question for another day, Josh, but I'm gonna throw it out there. In the Surplus Land Act, we are kind of in a unique situation where we have an airport in direct proximity to our holdings. In 1968, when this Surplus Land Act was put together, the Truckee Airport had just a handful of Cessna 150s bouncing in and off one runway. Now we got some very heavy iron flying in and out of that airport. Every once in a while, they'll auger in, and we've been very lucky here with our operation not having something like this happen. Does the FAA have any kind of overlying restrictions on what is happening in close proximity to their federally regulated airspace? This could be something that we might want to address before we, move further down the line here, because we're in a unique situation where we have an airport as our next door neighbor. And like I said, there's some pretty heavy iron flying in and out of there, big iron. And we might want to sit back and address any kind of FAA restrictions on what we're doing here.
So Dale, I might be able to, my recollection was when staff did a presentation on this maybe a year and a half ago, and I think it was before Josh was our attorney. I think
That was Andrew Days.
Yeah, Andrew was still with us. I think a part of that was there's the Truckee Tahoe Airport Land Use Compatibility Plan, which establishes basically safety zones in the vicinity of the runways, and it identifies restrictions on land development that can occur within different safety zones. So there's like a zone A, which is like right on the edge of the runway, and zone B, which is closer. So it's like A through E. And so I think there's a document out there that we actually got presented to us by staff about a year and a half ago that has some of that information in it.
We might want to unearth that and readdress it.
Yeah.
Because it could have some underlying limitations on where we're headed here.
Yeah, and it will affect land value, because if there's some
Exactly.
areas that have restrictions on certain types of development or certain densities, that will affect the value of the land.
Right.
Was there a map associated with that?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, the ALUP.
Yeah.
Actually, the first thing I ever did for you was like 2 decades ago was dealing with PAD and an ALUP update they were doing at the time. They wanted to try to spread the restrictions further afield than we felt was appropriate.
But I think that's the primary.
Yes.
I don't believe that there's another thing from the FAA in addition to the airport.
Yeah, and it's one of those deals where the state kind of takes the Fed requirements, puts it through the ALUP process, and that's what governs.
Josh, the map's got, we've talked about the property to the south of Jorger. It looks like I'm looking at it somewhere around 150 or so acres of land that we're sort of saying, hey, that seems to be in our principle, this area that could be developed. But when you go through this declaration of surplus land, we wouldn't kind of try and take the whole 150 acres and say, that's going to be surplus. I'm just trying to understand the process. It would be much more specific to a specific project, like, you see the purple area there that we kind of have earmarked a little bit for potential PUD, and it actually extends over a parcel line. When you go through the Surplus Land Act and that designation, we wouldn't do it as a blanket, and then after doing that, kind of parcel it up, would you do it as specific projects came up? Just trying to understand that.
Yeah. That would be the recommendation. You can do a blanket declaration. I wouldn't recommend it.
All right,
Among other things, particularly if you're trying to stay within exemptions, it's a lot easier. And my understanding from the board's discussion today is that you want to deal with first potentially your member agencies, then with other public entities that aren't necessarily members but are public and provide a public service. It's going to be a lot easier if you invite them to make proposals, you choose proposals you think fit within your criteria, and then as part of that process, just like you did with TTAD again, we've been dealing with this for 4 years, 5 years almost. And as part of that, we dealt with the surplus issue 2 years ago, but it was in response to that particular proposal. And I think that's really the way to proceed.
and when you've got, given the land out there isn't parcelized for development, it's kind of I don't know what the nature of those property lines are, but, just again, as an example, that purple polygon that's up there that extends over, 3 different parcels. Can you initiate the process on a kind of multi-parcel, or are we going to be required to do some sort of lot line adjustment and a bunch of investment in survey work before that to declare that a unique parcel? Or at what point do we start dealing with, the way the land is currently parcelized versus way it might end up looking in the future?
Great question, and I'm smiling because Mr. Fleming and I have just been through this with the TTAD exchange. So in essence, there's a law in the books that provides if a public agency is selling or taking land from another public agency, you can basically do a survey and just draw lines. You don't have to create a conforming parcel. You don't, in a lot of counties, you would go and get a certificate of compliance. But we talked in Nevada County about this. They said, no need, we don't want you to. If you go through that process, we're going to have to put you through the whole subdivision map back process. So we just left it alone. So it's a record in terms that you record a deed, you have the legal description and the plat attached to it. That essentially creates the legal lot. So you can slice, dice those existing APNs however you want and however you decide with any entity you're going to dispose to.
When you go to that Surplus Land Act and declare it a surplus, you need to define the boundaries of the property that you're talking about dealing, or can you just say generally a 20-acre parcel as shown on a map like this? And
Yes. Either way is fine, and it's just with TTAD, the process was so extended, you had the chance to kind of deal with that issue ahead of time, but in another situation, you might not. So, some kind of graphical map that just gives you the basic outlines would be sufficient.
thanks for this memo. Any other questions for Josh? Spent a really good chunk of time on this item. Dan, were you going to say something?
Oh, because Dale and I are meeting with staff tomorrow as the committee. We'll try to take the input we heard here and then chart a path forward. Richard?
Sounds good, and we'll have that presentation that Jay put together showing the airport portions. I'll email it out, but I'll also have that at the ad hoc committee tomorrow, so you can see that detail.
Okay. At this point, I'll open it up to public comment. Sven?
Yeah, thank you. Good morning. I actually don't have any prepared comments, but I figure if I'm going to be participating, and I was here last month, I should introduce myself because I haven't met most of you. My name is Sven Leff. I'm the general manager of the Recreation and Park District, and enjoy working with your agencies and with you separately in the provision as a public agency partner with you guys. A lot of great discussion today. I know we're a little tired of this one. I'm not going to go any further. I was here quite honestly just to learn what your guys' perspectives are, your questions, council's perspective on the Public Lands Act. You have a very large opportunity and challenge in front of you. I like the idea of taking your time. You have everything to consider from your own needs, your service, your constituencies, your histories, and your traditions, as well as CEQA and environmental, as well as public impact. There are FAA things and other infrastructure things that come out in codes and stuff when projects go forward. No reason to really belabor that now. I really just wanted to offer to you that as the Recreation and Park District as a partner agency, if I could be of any assistance in working with you guys, recreation, land use, just stuff in the neighborhood, you know, I'm always available. Some of you I've already worked with, you've got my direct contact. I can share that, or it can be found on the website. So I plan on hanging around. Just I'm really interested, as you know, I've got quite a long future in this community before I'm out here and retired, and so how we evolve, whether it's the town's plans or post-Blake's retirement and so forth. I'm just here as your partner, so I just thought I'd introduce myself and I wish you the best on this. Reach out if there's questions.
Thanks, Sven.
Thanks, Sven.
Anybody else? Okay, so I think we've not taken any direct action, but given some direction back to staff. And again, appreciate the efforts of the ad hoc committee.
So from this agenda item, it appears to me that we've all reached a conclusion and that we are going to be able to engage in direct dialogue with our constituents, and that to find out what kind of concerns they have, what kind of feedback they have, and we'll bring it back to the board.
Yeah, I would recommend that, if you have, that's a good action, I think. I don't think it's a required action, but certainly I think it's prudent to each of us to go back to our member agencies and share what's happening here and bring back that input. Okay, I'm going to close item 1 at this time. Move to item 2. It's the financials, month ending February 28th.
Before we move on, just one last thing. The items that are here on our agenda, if we could I sit back and have these notes duplicated and for a handout at my board meeting? Would that be acceptable? Would that be overstepping?
It's a public document in our open stuff, and so I think you can share.
So this is would be the findings of the ad hoc committee. I can just sit back and.
I think you could share that there's a draft guiding principle on surplus land with your.
That's probably the one change. Is we should probably get the word draft kind of plastered all over it.
Yeah. Okay, Liz, you're up.
Good morning, Board Director. Let's take a long, lengthy look at our financials. Just kidding. I'll give you the quick highlights. Will you put the presentation for that, please? I'll give you some quick highlights, no lowlights, and then we'll be able to move off of this item and get to some of our bulkier items in the agenda. Oh, I forgot I control it. It's just going to ask you to change it. So, as of February 28th, we are approximately 68% of the fiscal year elapsed. Let's just all take a deep breath at that. Holy cow, right? So again, orienting with the chart, the yellow dot shows where we would be, and the blue bar going up to the top is showing where we're at. So in looking at Fund 10, again, this is revenues only, Looking at Fund 10, we're about on trend. We're approximately 67% of our way there, as anticipated. We still have a teeter payment to go, and we will still have fund interest and other things that will come into revenue. For Fund 2, similar story. We're at 66%. So we're trending right along with the fiscal year. No surprises from revenues. Questions about revenues before I move to expenditures? Stunned silence, I'll take it. Taking a look at the expenditures, and again, we show Fund 6 here. Fund 6 doesn't have the same revenue sources as Fund 2 and Fund 10. So taking a look at our general fund, Fund 10, we're slightly below, trending at 62%. One highlight you all may have noticed if you looked at all of the details is that our insurance line item is over budget. As well as I tried to prepare that budget for the upcoming year, as we progressed through the year, I learned that there are 2 cycles related to insurance. We have some fiscal year plans and we have some annual plans. We also saw a very steep cost increase. So for the FY26 budget, we're going to take a few actions. We're going to try to see if we can get some better rates. We shop around a little bit. I'll also sharpen my pencil for the budget and make sure it's more accurate. Questions on Fund 10 expenditures before I quickly touch on Fund 6 and Fund 2?
Public entity insurance, reinsurance option,
I mean,
where you have regular insurance and then you have some thing that is first, these kind of entities that, ships it off to Bermuda and they do the 5 million extra on the, what I'm talking about.
so currently we're in a pool. I think that maybe changing pools might help us. I don't know that to be fact. I have to shop around and see.
Yeah.
And also seeing, to your point, what else is out there, right? Insurance is insurance,
Okay.
covers us in case things happen, but maybe we don't have to take the same avenue that we've always had. Again, this is the state of California, so I'm not going to tell you that insurance rates are going to go down dramatically, however we shop it, but let's right size it, make sure everything we have is right for us, see if we can skim some off.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions on Fund 10 expenditures? Okay, taking a look at Fund 2, again, still slightly below. Fund 6, a lot below. Nothing has changed with that. The progression of our capital projects related to timing, decision-making, all of those things. You will see a lot of the capital money rebudgeted. So when I come back to talk about the FY26 budget and I bring you the 5-year capital plan, I'm not telling you we saved a bunch of money this year. I'm telling you our spending plan just changed a little bit, so it will get spread out again. Questions about expenditures? All right, let's quickly talk about cash. So our total cash is approximately $44.5 million. We are trending slightly higher than our prior year if you take a look at the trend line in total cash. And some of that has to do with, in addition to the fund interest that we received this particular month, for Fund 10, we received $1.1 million in receivable money that gets booked as revenue throughout the 12 months. We did a direct bill in January. Now the cash is coming in the door. So that's why it doesn't look like we spent as much cash. We had a lot coming in. Thank you also, Northstar, for making your payment because we also received a large chunk of cash from that. So that's what offsets that. And that is the end of my presentation. Any questions overall? Okay, there's the recommended action before you.
Making a motion to approve the financials for the month ending February 28th.
Well, second.
Seconded. Comments? Hearing none. All in favor? Aye. Aye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. And we'll move on to request to award 2025 digital scanning sewer line project.
Everyone doing good on bathroom so far? Throw that out there. Morning, board of directors, Scott Fleming, senior engineer. So in front of you today, we've got the 2025 digital scanning of sewer lines. Just as a reminder, we advertised the project last fall. We got one single bid in. It was substantially over what we typically estimate for the project. Staff recommended the board proceed with delaying the scanning work. I also included in there language from our SSMP that establishes why we do this inspection work on a recurring basis. Staff recommended that instead of doing 1/3 of the Truckee River Interceptor every year, that we start doing the entire interceptor pipe once every 3/4 years. Economies of scale with the project for scanning. Basically to save the agency money with getting more bids and
better pricing. So we ended up advertising this past late winter, early spring timeframe. We received 2 bids. Historically, ProPipe has bid the project quite frequently, and so their price fell within the engineer's estimate of where we would be. I did put in, as a reminder, from the 2024 advertisement, the bid received. So you can see the price received for the total bid for the entire TRI was effectively the same price we received from an alternative contractor or bidder last fall, and it'll allow us to not have to scan again for another 3 or 4 years. So with that in mind, it's pretty straightforward. The staff are recommending that the agency moves forward with awarding the bid from ProPipe for the 2025 digital scanning to the amount of $232,260 with a 10% contingency for us to approve a contract amount up to $255,000. And just as background, that covers us for any potential change orders or contract modifications for pop-up work as it comes up. Just as kind of a last note, we do have plans to do TRI rehab this summer as well. So there's the potential we might want to have the contractors scan the pipe prior to the work, and depending on their mob time with the contract window, we can consider having going back after if there's any concern. So that 10% allows for that as well if we do want to do it. So that's all I got.
Scott, when you see the disparity of the 2 bids,
Yes.
the first thing that comes to mind is like a different process. Are they the same thing, or is
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. So I pulled numbers from the last 6 years just to kind of talk about volatility with the pricing that we've received between bidders. So for instance, I'll just walk it back a few years for you. So 2024 last fall, we got a bid of $6 per linear foot. 2023, we had a bid of $1.79 we awarded. 2022 was $2. 2021 was $4.56. 2020 was $2.86. 2019 was $3.04. 2018 was $3.75. So it's been really scattered, and I think a lot of that has to do with the bidders and what their schedule and availability looks like forecasting out. So the sooner we can get this bid out and the larger the job, we tend to see prices drive down. So between the two, a lot of it comes down to labor costs. The equipment itself is specified pretty thoroughly as what we call digital scanning equipment. It's basically a IVAC panorama unit that provides that 360 scan of the pipe. A few years back, staff evaluated moving over to that technology in lieu of what we call CCTV in the industry, closed circuit television, which is a more simplistic camera. The cost savings associated with going with CCTV aren't realized due to the fact that the labor is the primary driver of the cost for these kinds of inspection service projects. So the benefits associated with the IVAC panorama unit for providing us a more detailed visual of the inspection of the pipe, and considering we only do it once every 3 years, really drove that discussion with the board from past engineering group to move forward with doing this technology. So I don't anticipate, because of the way the specification is written, to answer your question, that they were proposing a different type of equipment piece. We do specify basically a 1080p unit. They've started coming out with 4K units that could potentially drive the price up, but we haven't moved to that additional requirement, as I don't see there's a lot of cost benefit for the agency with going with an ultra 4K for the inspection of the pipe relative to the potential cost and eliminating potential bidders. So I was hoping to get a couple more bids. We did have 5 attendees in the mandatory pre-bid, but it was held virtually. But, you know, I can't force people to bid on the project.
have we used ProPipe before?
We've used them quite a bit. Yeah, I think of the last 6 years, they've been 5 of the 6 contracts. So they typically are the ones that give the most competitive bids if they're interested in the project. Thus, the larger scale they're mobilizing out of, I think, Arizona, nowadays Southern California, Arizona. So the project, in order to attract larger bidders, bigger contractors, it's economies of scale, right? So,
correct me if I'm wrong here, Scott, but didn't we have our TV scanning divided into 4 sections, and that we would do 25% of our system every year and then rotate back are we still on that program?
No, so it's 1/3 of the TR. We have a total of 6 schedules. Lucas, do you mind going to the next slide here for me? Include the attachment. He should have item 2. Maybe it wasn't included in the board packet. I don't think I received it.
Yeah, it was.
This is not yes, it's attached on the board packet. If you click on the bookmarks, yeah, it's in the packet.
Yeah.
it'll just help me a little bit visually kind of explain how we break up PRI and everything.
You click on the go.
What am I looking for?
Click on the little tab underneath regular agenda on the left, right there. And go to item 3, and there's another bookmark.
Perfect.
Next page.
And then check out the next.
It's the next page if you just scroll.
There you go.
Perfect. So basically, this attachment included into the board package shows for figure 1-1, the breakout of the schedules. So schedule 1 starts in Top City and then it moves through all the way to schedule 6 at the wastewater treatment plant. Schedules in 5 and 6 are basically parallel lines. As you guys were talking about the land exchange earlier, there was 2 green lines shown. That's because at the ponds, just upstream of us, we have the ability to convert flow between schedule 5 and schedule 6. So historically, we've scanned schedules 1 and 2 each fiscal year, well, once every 3 years, schedules 3 and 4 consecutively, and then schedules 5 and 6. So the most recent scan we performed was schedules 5 and 6 in 2023. So last fall, when we advertised for schedules 1 and 2, which are the most upstream segments from Tahoe City, basically to the Alpine area, Alpine and Olympic Valley area there. It's not exactly there. It looks like it's actually just a little bit downstream of Olympic Valley. But when we got quite a substantially larger bid than we anticipated, and we were having challenges attracting other interested bidders due to the size of the project and the time window, it was recommended that we pursue all 6 schedules once every 3 years. So we're still compliant with the water board and our expectations with our SSMP as far as inspecting. In either case, we're only scanning the TRI once every 3 years, whether we alternate once every 3 years with just 2 schedules of the 6, or we just do all of it now and then wait 3 years. We're compliant and we're scanning at the same frequency of interval. It's just how you package it up, really, is what it's coming down to.
So that's the TRI, but aren't we responsible for other infrastructure besides this TRI that we scan?
Not as far as, like, we don't maintain any other collections items as far as it goes, just the interceptor pipe.
So our liability is only the TRI.
I mean, you could make a statement that we have a responsibility to the ratepayers to continue a program as we do with asset management inside the plant fence, but that's not established in the SSMP. So, and every collections entity, as far as I understand in the state, falls under these same requirements to some level. They establish their own SSMPs, how they manage and upkeep their actual collection system. So Olympic Valley would have some level of inspection program as well, and within a frequency established by that entity.
So you're saying stuff coming down Alpine is Alpine Springs responsibility?
100%. We do not handle any of the collection systems for the member districts.
Okay.
There's a conversation that can be had about the associated discharges going into those sewers and our level of pre-treatment involvement with your customers if they're going to discharge into your sewer collection systems for each of your member districts and then ultimately discharge into our sewer interceptor pipe. But as it goes otherwise, we maintain and upkeep the TRI. That is our responsibility. It's our infrastructure, but we don't handle the infrastructure of the member districts.
And those required to scan every 3 years too in our district, or not necessarily?
It depends on what your SSMP outlines. So, Blake, do you mind me asking offhand? I'm sure you guys have an SSMP.
Every agency's got this SSMP document and has to define some sort of condition assessment program. TSD similarly sets a goal of CCTV its infrastructure once every 3 years.
Okay.
Joe would be able to answer that question to you. I think he contracts out with a private entity to do that.
Yeah, the frequency is established by the district. So,
yeah, no, I get that. Yeah. Where I'm going is, why don't we do it for everybody and get the economies of scale and then charge it out?
I mean, in the future, a coordination project, if the other districts are interested in performing, but
every 3 years for everybody. I mean, that
we have our own TV equipment and staff. Like that. Yeah, I think your agency, because the quantity of infrastructure doesn't have sufficient, it takes us, all summer to get through our 1/3 of the system. And so we do that in-house, so we wouldn't contract for that, but certainly it's GM should get together and talk about it. There's a value in bringing a contractor up and getting that on, Scott, good job in the recommendation not to accept last year's and getting such a good pricing for the entire project this year. Is there a requirement that they get all this work done in this construction season, or is there an expectation that it may actually bleed over? It's a lot of linear footage for them to do in a year. Is there an expectation that it will all get done this year?
Yes. So typically or historically, they've been able to scan 2 of the 6 schedules in about 2 weeks, and
all right.
approximately giving them about a month. So we extended out the window of time for the inspection to start basically after the holidays of the 4th of July. So there is going to be some challenges this year with an extended inspection window and coordinating that with the member districts and the associated trails, right? So with the town of Truckee and the Legacy Trail, as well as with Tahoe City PUD. I'm going to point to the end again because and Truckee River Trail as well. We'll need to coordinate that work, but the intent is to start mid-July and finish before October 30th. So we stay in the dry season.
So will this interfere with the other TRI project that's going on?
So the beauty of it is we control the construction schedule or inspection schedule of both projects. So we will coordinate the contractors respectively for both of those 2 projects.
That's just 2 pipe segments, right? And I'm sure that lining project requires a pre and post TV.
Yes, and it's a few more reaches, but generally speaking, what I would like to see happen is us inspect ideally before, because that section of the TRI is scheduled to get lined kind of, I think, I'm looking over Jason, I haven't seen the most recent schedule, but it's like late summer or fall, correct? After Labor Day. So, and that's got to do with flows and the bypass associated. So we would prefer to not step on their toes, and obviously while they're mid-lining, have the contractor trying to inspect the pipe with it. That coordination shouldn't be too challenging for us.
Okay. Great. Just one last, hopefully quick question. Just, does TTSA have the necessary access easements? I know some of the TRI line, particularly downstream from probably Squaw, where you're not on the bike path, runs through private properties, and while you probably have an easement overlying it, sometimes you have to cross. Did the agency acquire access easements also to get to those manholes, or is it just landowners allow this to happen because it's a benefit to the greater community?
It's a combination of both, and I'll look at Josh, but there's typically a term. I think prescriptive easement is what we've used, right? Open prescriptive easement.
And prescriptive easement potentially. There's something expressed.
It hasn't been an issue. No property owners have balked at allowing access to either TSD crews or TTSA crews or our contractors to access those manholes for condition assessment inspections.
And not historically, and part of that is there's a couple answers to that question. So I'll keep it brief because you guys have a meeting.
What about our friend along the river?
Well, we told
81 to 83.
If you're doing construction, I understand that's a different matter.
So
but
we
it's not impact.
require 1,500 linear feet of cable for scanning because some of the segments are just not scannable for access to the manholes just due to the nature of their location. So the contractor will typically have to bypass certain manholes where we're not doing a full manhole scan. So they're really dropping the camera down and recording from once it's in the pipe. So a lot of times, depending on the location that they're scanning, they'll just go through a manhole onto the next one. So the contract's pretty strict on that, and we've had to enforce it with contractors where they propose using shorter lengths of cable that attach the camera with tractor assembly. So that's one way we navigate around those challenges or issues, but there are certain manholes where we do have to access through private property, but we've never historically had an issue.
Right.
I'm not going to get into discussing specifics on easements and the detail of that. It's something that, while we have language for easements, the completeness of the actual easement language is something that can be open for discussion depending on how detailed you want to dive into that, but it's something I think.
The contractor nor the agency anticipates any conflicts getting access to what needs to be done on this.
And most of the homeowners are usually pretty respectful of understanding the importance of the sewer. Good, communicate that to them. A lot of times, if it's a newer home, they'll ask, "What is that in my yard?" Kind of do a polite introduction and explain what it is. We've never had an issue with that since I've been.
Thank you, Scott. entertain a motion to approve the 2025
I move,
inspection.
I move to approve the 2025 digital scanning project.
Second,
Second.
second by Wilkins. Any comments? Hearing none, all in favor? Aye. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you.
Item 4,
Yes, in light of Scott asking, would it be possible to take a couple-minute break for restroom?
sure, let's recess for 5 minutes. Okay, we'll go back into open session. Item 4 is staff seeking approval to submit a letter. The request is CSDA regarding the Clean Fleet Initiative. I don't know if you want to give a bunch of information there, but
Yeah,
in 5 minutes, I think it's a no-brainer
I would.
to be advocating to reduce some of those restrictions on the electric fleet. So,
Yeah, I'd move approval.
Okay.
The item.
second. Great. Any additional discussion? Hearing none, all in favor? Aye. Thank you for getting that on there, Richard. Item 5 is we're being asked to vote on the special district representative for the Placer County LAFCO. I noticed that one of the representatives is actually here in Eastern County and is a board member on the Tahoe City PUD. And so, Dan, maybe you could, I would lean that way, but I just want to get, if you give them the thumbs up.
I would move that we vote for Judy Friedman as the LAFCO representative.
Second.
Great. Any discussion? Hearing none. All in favor? Aye. Fantastic. Okay, item 6, presentation and acceptance, possible acceptance of the nutrient removal alternative study project.
Let's see, it's working. Well, good morning, board. I'm Ricky Gutierrez with Pearl Engineers, and I'm excited to present on the findings and recommendations of the nutrient removal alternatives process evaluation that we've been working on here for the past year. It's been a very rewarding process, working collaboratively with TTSA staff and managers and the board as well involved throughout this process. A lot of meetings and workshops. We've had 6 workshops, two of which were what we call our camp process, where we spent 6 hours in the room on both of those days, vetting through all the alternatives that we were evaluating and narrowing in on the finalist list of alternatives and finally selecting an alternative through that detailed process. And so that's some of what I'll present to you guys today on. So this timeline that I have up on the screen shows the process that we went through. Below the line there are the steps that we took through this process, and on the top are the official board interactions, and those are just the official ones. Obviously, the board was involved in some of the workshops as well as the site visits that we did to look at some of the alternatives that we shortlisted, including the eroded granular sludge, the MBR alternative, and the 5-stage Barton reactors. We took some trips over to Colorado and Washington to look at some facilities that had those and help inform the process. So the first step, we developed evaluation parameters and also took a closer look at the existing facility evaluation, updating flow and load projections from what we had done in the 2021 master plan to current days, as well as taking the fresh eyes on the condition assessment, working with plant's operation and maintenance staff to identify the current needs of the facility and better align the cost of what the existing facility needs to continue operating for the next 50 years. And we presented those at the first board meeting that we had. The next step was the initial alternatives screening. We looked at a universe of alternatives, everything under the sun that could potentially work for your facility in terms of meeting your very stringent nutrient limits, some of the most stringent in the whole country, and narrowed that down to 8 alternatives that we then screened down to 3, which was the shortlisted alternatives, that next bullet there. presented that to the board, how we got there, and then finally had our final workshop where we landed on the recommendation and developed that to a 10% conceptual design level. And the reason we decided to take this as part of this process to a 10% level was that we wanted enough definition there to be able to then move forward into a final design and start the permitting process, the environmental permitting process, which can be lengthy for a project of this scope and size. And so we wanted to have enough definition in there, and 10% was determined to be that level to get us moving forward. So this is where we are today, presenting the 10% conceptual design and final recommendations for this process. So the agenda I've laid out, we'll start with some of the background goals and objectives. I'll try to go through those quickly since a lot of that you've already seen before, but most of you have seen before. I know Director Clementis knew, but we will go through that process, how we landed there, the alternatives that we evaluated, a quick overview on those, and then get into the life cycle cost analysis, the 50-year cost analysis that we did. Liz will present afterwards on how that impacts the financials for TTSA. I'll just give an overview on the cost analysis. Then we'll get into the construction schedule for the proposed project, as well as the final recommendations and look at the conceptual design of the proposed facilities. And feel free to stop me along the way if you have any questions. I have about 30 minutes of presentation here, but I'll try to keep to that. So as far as background, so this figure here on the right shows the existing facilities at the TTSA water reclamation plant. The yellow is original 50-year-old facilities that were constructed originally as part of this, the inception of the plant. And so you can see about over half of the facilities here at TTSA are at that 50 years of age, and that is really nearing the age of useful life of a lot of this infrastructure, especially mechanical equipment, but also the concrete starting to deteriorate. The facility is very complex in terms of operations. This is the most complex facility I've ever worked on in my career, and most of the staff that have worked on it say the same. Especially for a 9 MGD plant, the operations here and the way that processes have been added onto the facility over time have made it very complex plant to operate for the size of this plant. Maintenance costs continue to increase as the facility ages. Obviously, there's more and more need for replacing components over time, so those costs continue to go up. There's concern that the existing processes as they are may not be adequate for meeting future discharge requirements if they become more stringent. A cost of $158 million in improvements was determined would be necessary over the next 20 years to keep this plant operational. And so that was the genesis for looking into what other alternatives there are.
A quick question, Ricky.
Yes.
So when we look at the 50-year-old items, are we running into a situation where those parts or components are no longer being processed or made?
I'm sure there are some obsolete pieces of equipment out there. I mean, a lot of them if we're going to replace a pump, we replace it with a newer model that doesn't have those obsolete items. I'm sure some operations remain set.
Tanner, I saw you nodding your head.
No poker face on that one. Yeah, there's a lot of equipment that's very old. Peabody models, for example, a lot of infrastructure on firefighters that haven't existed for 20 years, maybe 30. I'm not sure. So some of those parts are difficult to get. Some companies have created the ability to bridge gap, and they make aftermarket parts for some of that stuff. Some things we just have to wholesale replace and swap out with a newer version of similar functions. It just depends, but a lot of the infrastructure is very old. Things that weren't included in the expansion, a lot of that infrastructure, many other companies don't exist anymore.
And that's part of what's making so complex. Yeah. It's not easy to just bolt something on there.
You have a 50-year-old classic vehicle here.
That's, yeah,
Classic.
an analogy.
So, another thing we wanted to point out, the existing water reclamation plant uses a pretty chemically intensive process for nutrient removal. Back 50 years ago when the plant was conceived, that was the best way to hit your very low nutrient limits. This was one of the first plants to have to hit such low total nitrogen, total phosphorus limits in your effluent. And so they used a lot of chemicals to accomplish that. Lime for the phosphorus removal process, which is not only expensive, it's a pain to work with, it's corrosive, it cakes up, creates issues. Methanol, which is very expensive, but also highly flammable and explosive. That's used for the nitrogen removal process that you have for supplemental carbon. And there's just risks in handling and transporting all these chemicals. Liquid oxygen as well is used for the carbonaceous oxidation process. So liquid oxygen also gets trucked up here for that process. And so it's costly, it's energy intensive, and there's high operation and maintenance requirements associated with the use of all these chemicals, in addition to some safety concerns. So as far as the project rationale and why we're looking at this time, why TTSA staff decided it was the time to look at alternatives, because it's the fiscally responsible to look at alternative treatment solutions now, due to these high costs of operating and maintaining the existing facility, as Director Wilson alluded to, and the high cost to rehabilitate the treatment plant and keep it operational for the foreseeable future. The other reason was that we wanted to see if implementing the new treatment solution would reduce the overall risk to the facility. And there's several risks that were identified throughout this process. Risks in handling and transport of the chemicals, as I mentioned, but there's also risks of seismic vulnerability. A lot of the facilities that are built prior to the 90s were not designed to current seismic code. So there's a risk that if there is a seismic event, some of those could potentially fail and risk not meeting your permit. There's risks associated with future permit limits, which is a little bit unknown, and what it would take to get the facility to meet those. Risk in maintaining operations during rehabilitation. So if the rehabilitation option moves forward, sort of like a surgical operation where we have to keep the plant operational and running while we're doing the rehab work and taking facilities offline to accomplish that, it gets pretty tricky. And finally, the risk relying on aging infrastructure. So as components fail, components become obsolete and fail, then that adds to the risk of the infrastructure not doing what it needs to do. So for all these reasons, we determined this was the time TTSA determined this was the time to look into this. So the project goal was to identify the best value long-term solution for nutrient removal at the TTSA water reclamation plant. We wanted to identify the nutrient removal system that is the most reliable, most efficient, minimizes risk, and most economical in terms of a 50-year life cycle cost analysis. So as far as the project objectives, we took this 4-step process here where we first wanted to compare available nutrient removal technologies to identify the best potential solution for TTSA, then investigate the financial feasibility for the shortlisted alternatives. As I mentioned, we came up with 3 shortlisted alternatives that we took to a high level of evaluation, including visiting some of those facilities that were comparable to TTSA and maintaining and comparing that to maintaining the status quo, which would be rehabilitation of the existing plant. Then we selected the option that we felt best met the agency's needs as well as the community's, and then we took that to the 10% design level. Now I want to go through the evaluation process. So starting out, as I mentioned, TTSA has very stringent nitrogen and phosphorus limits. We looked across the country for comparable facilities that are having to meet these, and there's very few out there. There's a few in Florida, there's a few in the Northwest, but there's not a whole lot of plants that have to meet a total nitrogen limit at 3 and the total phosphorus limit at 0.3. And this is what your current WDR waste discharge requirements are at well 31. The receiving water limits are even lower than that. So if you were discharging directly into Martin Creek, for example, those limits are actually about half of what your total nitrogen limits are for the ground disposal at well 31. And those were really nearing the limits of what you can do with available technologies. Even the 3 and 0.3 is difficult to achieve, but it has been proven to be achievable at several locations. Getting down to 1.45, you start looking at fractionation of nitrogen and how that impacts things. And so it can get very costly to get that low. So hopefully it doesn't go any lower than the 3 and 0.3, but that's what we used as our basis.
And is that, even though it's a well 31 and we have a mile of subsurface?
Yeah, so
do we try and hit those at the end of pipe before it even goes into the aquifer?
Our design assumption moving into this was that we wanted to hit that at end of pipe.
Okay.
We didn't want to rely on soil aquifer treatment, which is sort of an unknown black box, and relying on that to gain compliance. We're sort of seeing that as more of a buffer that you have to kind of exceed if things don't go exactly as planned. But yeah, we wanted to meet it at end of pipe. That's what the goal was with the new technologies.
And that's what we hit currently. We do some end of pipe water quality sampling. We are targeting the same thing now, right?
Not all of them.
No, some of them we rely on the soil aquifer to.
During summer, when we were down to a 2 average for the month, we were actually above what the requirement. This is the annual average, is the 3. We also have a summertime average that we have to be below a 2 at well 31. And looking back at history, there would have been times that we would have been above that rather than the times on the effluent pipe. We still met the requirement of well 31, but we did not meet it into that.
Question. So this chart shows the initial alternative screening results. Sorry, the font's a little bit small on the right, but on the right-hand side was the evaluation criteria in all those different colors. Those were all the different criteria that we worked with TTSA and the board to establish as the important criteria for evaluating each of these alternatives against each other. And so we have these 8 alternatives that involve several different processes, intensification processes, but all of these were determined to be those that could meet your discharge permit requirements for nitrogen and phosphorus. And so through this process, we landed on 3 alternatives that kind of really stood out against the others through this process, looking at the evaluation criteria. And those are conventional 5-stage BART-INFO, which has been around for a very long time, proven process that uses biological treatment to remove nitrogen and phosphorus. Membrane bioreactor, which tacks on a membrane to the end of a biological process to get a higher quality effluent, and then an aerobic granular sludge process, which is a newer technology that's only been there's only a few plants out there operating with this process, but it has shown a lot of promise for nutrient removal. So, and simplicity of operations. So those were the ones that were included in the final short list of evaluation, along with obviously rehabilitation, even though it ranked low, that is still on the table throughout this whole process.
Hey, Rick, I've got a question on that, because when this presentation was done, when we were kind of narrowing from the larger list of options to the smaller list, there was, and maybe you'll get to it, but there was, I think, a lot of thinking that went into the aerobic granular sludge, and gee, is that really the technology of the future? That's not quite here yet. And maybe as you're continuing down this screening process, you can touch on that a little bit more.
Sure, yeah, and we did hit on that a lot, and actually the next slide talks a little bit about some of the ways we thought we could potentially make aerobic granular sludge work. So once we got down to those 3 shortlisted alternatives, we looked at some hybrid alternatives, which would either minimize sunk assets by incorporating the biostir facility and downsizing. So we came up with an alternative 1B, which started with the conventional 5-stage BART-INFO, but took out the denitrification step and utilized your existing infrastructure with the BNR process, the biological nutrient or nitrogen removal process, which we call biostir, using the biostir for denitrification, the denitrification step to reduce the footprint of that facility. So that's the one that we moved forward to the final, was that sort of hybrid alternative. And then 3B, which is the aerobic granular sludge, also tacking on the biostir for further denitrification as a kind of belt and suspenders step at the end, since we were concerned. We talked to several facilities. There's only 2 out here out west that operate on aerobic granular sludge currently. One we visited in Colorado Springs, Idaho Springs, Colorado. Idaho Springs, Colorado. The other one is in Whitefish, Montana. It's been operational for a few years, and we had a meeting with staff there, with their staff, their operations staff, talking about how that process has worked out for them. And then we've got a lot of information from aerobic granular sludge facilities that are built throughout the world, several in Europe. But none of those facilities have your as stringent of limits as TTSA has. So they were shown that they could consistently get below 5 TN, but getting down to 3 every now and then they would, and other times they wouldn't. And so there was a big question mark as to, can this process consistently get down to that? It doesn't have as many dials that you can turn as you have with other processes that we have, like the MBR and the conventional approach. There's a lot more things that you can do to play with to get down to those low limits, versus AGS is sort of what it is. And so we were concerned that it might not consistently get as low as you need to get. And so adding on the biostir at the end would hopefully get you to that step. However, that's never been done. And so the recommendation, if we were to move forward with an alternative like that, would be to do some piloting to understand how that performance would work, coupling the aerobic granular sludge with the biostir facility. So that would be probably about a year-long process, a few $1 million for that. And staff was concerned we could get to the end of the process and then end up back to where we are at square one, looking at another alternative if that didn't pan out the way we were hoping. So those were some of the reasons we landed where we did. And so the next step we took once we came down, narrowed it down to basically these 2 hybrid alternatives and the MBR process, was to, we came out of that first camp day where we identified these hybrid alternatives, and then decided to independently go back and evaluate things, and then come back to the table on the next camp day with where we landed and where each of us landed independently, without costs considered, and then we went forward with the cost analysis. So this next chart shows a non-economic evaluation of those alternatives that Carollo did. So this was Carollo's process. We went back, used our same evaluation criteria that we had used at the start, but also weighted some of that based on the what we felt was most important to the agency, the criteria that was most important to the agency. We weighted those a little higher. And we ended up with the MBR on top, just slightly above the aerobic granular sludge as number 2. TTSA took a similar approach. They did a poll that Jason put out and sent out to staff and managers to conduct a similar evaluation. And they also came up with MBR on the top, and AGS second, and A2O with the biostir coupled on as the third process there, number 3. And so it was nice to see that we had independently aligned on that alternative. We had some discussion about it at the second camp, the workshop day that we did, and then proceeded to move forward with that process and fine-tuning it and working out some of the details. So that's what we're going to present here in a few. So, but first I want to hit on the cost analysis piece, since that is probably one of the most important parts of this presentation. So starting with capital cost comparison, I know these numbers are probably a bit shocking. We have $393 million for alternative 0, about $308 million for alternative 2, which is the MBR alternative. I wanted to first note that these total project costs are not just for construction now, but we're assuming midpoint of construction in 2030. These also include a future improvements. So for alternative 0, it's, you know, about 158 million escalated to 2030 ends up being about 190 million that has to be done in 2030 or over the next 10 years. And then there's another step in there that Liz will show in her analysis where we have 20 years down the road. There's another project that has to happen to keep this facility operating for that next 30 years. And so we assume that was another $150 million in today's dollars that happens in 20, I believe it's 2050. And so that's included in that total project cost, that additional 150 million in today's dollars. For alternative two, similarly, we have about 280 million in 2030 dollars, and then 30 years down the road, which is nearing the end of life of some of that mechanical equipment that would be installed in 2030, replacing that in 2060 with replacing a lot of the equipment in 2060. So that's like another $30 million that needs to be spent in 2060 to keep it running for the 50-year life cycle. And so with that, there's a 22% difference here with the MBR alternative coming on top over the 50 years, just in terms of capital costs.
Rick, do we have a question?
Sure.
So I just want to make sure I understand. So alternative zero, there's an assumption of a near-term project that replaces a lot of the bulk of the 50-year-old infrastructure, and then replaces all of it again 20 years from now, or
not all of it.
Just
other elements that would need to be replaced, plus some of the So we'd replace, you know, much of the plant that's identified right now in the current CIP that needs to be replaced as part of that first project. 20 years down the road, there's going to be need for additional replacements and additional work. At that point, your concrete tanks are going to be 70 years old. There's going to be some additional rehabilitation needs 20 years down the road that have to happen. That could end up being at 20 years down the road. If you don't do alternative two now, it could be alternative two happening 20 years down the road, or it could be some other, it could be AGS, it could be some other alternative that's you know, the best solution at that time, right? So,
and then with alternative two, the assumption there is basically building an MBR facility, demolishing the portions of this facility that are no longer needed with the MBR facility. Right. But then there's an assumption of additional replacement of that infrastructure 30 years in the future.
Yeah, not a wholesale replacement, but replacement of equipment, wear items. So pumps, we're assuming last about 30 years is typical when you're doing planning. You assume mechanical equipment has a 30-year life, electrical equipment has about a 30-year life. So a lot of that electrical and mechanical equipment 30 years down the road would need to be replaced.
Okay.
And you know, in reality, a lot of that will probably happen as part of the maintenance over time, but right. We wanted to kind of have a better apples to apples comparison on the capital costs. And so since we're including that big rehabilitation for alternative zero, we also wanted to factor in the replacement costs that would have to happen 30 years down the road for alternative two.
Okay, thank you.
Did we cost out any of the other alternatives?
Yes, we costed those out as well.
And any of them less than 308?
Yes. The alternative, well, the other two shortlisted alternatives were lower in total capital costs than alternative two that was selected as the one to move forward. But there were several reasons why, as you saw in the non-cost evaluation, why we felt that both TTSA and Gorilla felt that alternative two was the preferred solution, even though it was not the least costly solution out of the three alternatives.
Just a couple of quick questions.
Sure.
In both of these alternatives, when we were looking at the overlay of the proposed MBR and the existing facility that's 50 years old,
mm-hmm.
all of the stuff in the yellow was infrastructure that's going to be decommissioned?
No, and I'll get to that slide, but no, the stuff in the yellow is what's remaining of your existing facilities.
Okay, so.
Or are you talking about the process? I can jump ahead to.
Well, there was some, when we had discussions a month or two ago, we were talking about getting rid of some clarifiers and some of the infrastructures that was
yes.
used in our 75 technology that wouldn't be used in this new technology?
Right, so this one here, that's your existing process flow diagram for the plant. So all the processes that are highlighted in orange would go away.
Okay, so when it goes away, that's easily said, but what about the cost of making it go away? Is that
That's
included?
included in that.
Included in that.
Yes, included
So
in
that was
the facilities.
what Dan was touching on. Both the alternatives have not only decommissioning, the abandonment of the old infrastructure, but getting rid of it.
Correct.
And the second thing was housing some of this infrastructure that would be going in. Now, if I remember correctly, some of this infrastructure that would be going in would, when we looked at it in your workshop, it was kind of open air, and you made a comment, or one of your consultants made a comment that it would work in the open air. However, if to be user friendly in our environment, we'd have to construct some kind of a enclosure for the new proposed infrastructure. Is that part of this overall?
So we are assuming that the membrane bioreactor facility is in a new building, which you'll see in the renderings that we put together. So that whole facility is in a building. The part that we have left outside is the bioreactor process, which there's a conventional design approach that those facilities are not usually covered and can work well in severe environments. There's several facilities out there with the bioreactors that are not covered, in some of the ones we saw in Colorado, as well as
And Colorado has the same type of environment with snow
and
heavy
conditions.
heavy
Built them
snow.
up in Avon and Telluride, other areas that have similar processes.
So in both of the alternatives that we looked at, the infrastructure improvements include enclosure.
Yes, for the MBR process, yes, we are enclosing that whole
They
thing.
include enclosure.
Yeah, and as well as screen the facility, and I'll go through those when I show you the renderings, which facilities are enclosed and which aren't. But the only facility that's not in a building is the bioreactor tanks, because it's large tankage and just not efficient. We could evaluate it further. We looked at potentially just putting a canopy over the top of it. There's options there that we can continue to look at as we move into final design and determine if it's cost effective or not to incorporate. But for this level, what we've costed out, which we feel is a good approach, is to enclose as many facilities as possible except for the bioreactor facility.
So my final question would be, in the enclosure, you mentioned that the operation created its own environment. This is in one of the workshops. And in order to mitigate that environment, you had to have make up air and recirculating air and then make up heat and everything that goes
Very
along
good
with that.
ventilation system, yes.
A ventilation and dehumidifiers and all of that stuff.
Yes.
Does the cost of operation of this alternate operation, other than the actual MBR, is that part of this number as well?
Yeah, we included that in the operational costs, and we've included the cost of the ventilation fans that are associated with the buildings that we've included, as well as the odor control facilities that we're assuming are going to be needed for the screening process. All those operational costs are already included.
So both of the alternatives include operation of the
Operational costs.
operational costs.
That was the next slide I was going to get to, actually. I'll go back. Sorry. Here we go. So this first slide was just capital costs, and this is just the cost of the infrastructure, the capital cost of the infrastructure. The next one we looked at was staffing requirements. And so alternative zero is what your current staffing is, staff of about 28. Given that with the rehabilitation, if we do move forward with rehabilitation, it's likely that number may actually need to increase just because of the complexities of doing rehabilitation and having facilities offline and in coordination with those, that number could actually go up, but that is your current number. For the MBR alternative, we landed at a number of 21, and this is based on a lot of comparable utilities and facilities. The big reason for that large change is that the new process would not need to be staffed 24/7. You could, run it 10-hour days, and at night you would have some on-call staff, but you wouldn't need to have somebody necessarily out here 24/7 as you currently need to. And that's common among MBR plans. So the MBR alternative reduces staffing requirements by 25%. We're assuming this would happen over attrition over time, not necessarily layoffs. So that is a savings in operations.
That's O&M costs.
Yes.
Yeah, and staffing, not overall staffing of 25%. It's to address administrative staff.
Right.
Okay.
As far as life cycle costs, we took a close look at chemicals since that's really where a bulk of that is. There's a lot more chemicals currently being used than would need to be used as part of the alternative 2, so going from 7 down to 4. And you can see the cost there. This $1.3 million is what TTSA currently spends on chemicals just for the nutrient removal thing. So this again is just looking at nutrient removal. So about $1.3 million currently. If you went to alternative 2, that number goes down to about $800,000 a year. And this is one where this cost is going. This cost will continue to go up. The number that we have in there for methanol, this was a few months ago. This $1.96 a gallon for methanol is now at about $3 a gallon, I believe. And those numbers just keep going up. And so that's a cost that's a big risk for the agency that can continue to increase, just the cost of chemicals and trucking those chemicals. So reducing the amount of chemicals from 7 down to 4. The MBR alternative reduces the total volume of chemicals used at the facility since we're relying more on a biological process than a chemical process, and also reduces the annual chemical cost by about 38%. So the total life cycle cost, this table uses net present value to look at your capital costs, and these are 2030 costs, net present value to 2030. Your capital costs, there's lower capital costs and about $2.6 million lower operational costs, so about a 25% relative difference between the two alternatives. So MBR has a 25% lower 50-year life cycle cost than the rehabilitation alternative status quo. Any other questions on cost before we move on to schedule?
Yeah, so what happens when your final design is $408 million instead of $300?
Yeah, well, the goal is that at this level, that hopefully we were pretty conservative in our cost estimating. We don't ever want to be the low bid. So we took a pretty detailed approach at the cost estimate, which we were happy to provide with our expert cost estimators to look at comparable projects. It doesn't mean that things couldn't escalate more than what we anticipate. We're assuming a 5% escalation factor year over year, which we're thinking is fairly conservative. But obviously there's a lot of uncertainties out there, right? There's tariffs happening. There's other things that could impact costs that, you might not have accounted for at this time.
Sorry, the last 3 projects, what was your actual to final, your pre to final difference?
We've been, my last 3 projects specifically, let me think back. So the last one I did was for South Tahoe PUD. We did a clarifier project last year that came in just slightly under engineer's estimate. One for Watsonville that was about a $50 million project. That one has been a couple years ago. That one came in just slightly above engineer's estimate. I think the engineer's estimate was 52 and it came in at 53, something like that. That was right after COVID, 2023-ish. So this is really good anyway. So they've been coming in pretty close. We've been trying, obviously there was that time in 2020, 2021 where things were just getting blown out of the water. We weren't weren't really seeing what was going on because it was happening so fast. Those things have now stabilized a bit, and I have a chart at the end that I added in just in case you guys want to see that. It kind of shows kind of how construction costs have been looking for our specific industry over the last several years. So kind of gives you an idea of what that is. I can jump ahead to it if you like.
We'll do it then.
Hey, Matt, correct me if I'm wrong, and you can throw that clicker at me. When we first had our first workshop,
Yes.
we were looking at an overall cost of $262.
262, yes.
Yep. I'm right on that.
Yes.
Now we're talking 3 months later, we're talking 308.
Yeah, and again, the 308 also includes a project, so the 262 number that we had given at that first estimate, right? That did not include the future capital cost for replacement of equipment 30 years down the road, which the 308 number does include. So that's one difference. The other difference is that first estimate was based on the very high level, kind of a level 5 conceptual. We hadn't done any of the detailed parts of this design. We were just trying to compare the 3 alternatives against each other as part of that before we had really refined that to a 10% design. So this design is now, or this estimate is now your kind of 10% design level estimate, where we've gone through, some of the things that added to that 262. We're putting more things in buildings. Some of the things that, just some of the things that we worked out in more detail since that process. So that went from 262 to about 280 is where we're at now for that capital cost that we would anticipate seeing at the bid date a few years from now.
I don't want to excuse
So there is about a 10%. There is about a 10%.
thing, I remember when we went through BNR, we went through this graduated process, and every time we had a meeting and every time we had a review, things kept getting more expensive and more expensive, and I just wonder if we're on this same movie here, where we started out at 262 and we're going to eventually be at 408.
Yeah, I mean, we're carrying a large contingency on this because there's still a lot of unknowns at this level of design. So at this level of design, there is so this is a class 4 estimate, which is what we consider. So it could be 25% higher, it could be 30% lower. So that's kind of the range of where we're at on this less estimate.
Okay, the reason I ask this question is that if you have this kind of flexibility in the cost increases as it ratchets up, I think it's going to make a very problematic situation for the agency to project costs of what our loan's going to be in order to cover the costs at the end of this deal.
It's a very
And when you sit back and you keep having the cost of construction is going to go up 10% a year, maybe not that much, but so when we're looking at putting together a budget to pass on the cost to our customers, we need to have some kind of a solid number that we can wrap our arms around. And right now, you guys have done a lot of work. And I'll tell you, 95% of it's been over my head. But the 5% that isn't over my head is the fact that the cost keeps going up. And we've got to be able to figure out how we're going to get the money. And
You brought your checkbook, right?
I got my own philosophy on that, but it's just
I guess what I would say to that.
it's just kind of this is just a repeat of an old movie that I went through.
Just not to spoiler, the item we're on right now is accepting the report. There's a subsequent item on the agenda where we're going to be asked to take action to move forward with a direction on it. And I know that staff and Scott and I were privy to some of the work that was done in the finance committee that gets beyond these hundreds of millions of dollars and it brings it back to with financing and what do we need to do to bring in the revenue stream. So So it's coming,
It's coming.
you know, I mean,
Okay,
based on
I'll
this
prepare
information.
myself.
To hit on your point, Director Cox, we were pretty conservative on these estimates. We don't want to be the low bid on bid day. There is a range here at this level at 10% design where, you know, we could be 25% low, we could be 30% high, but hopefully within that range is where we're trying to hit. So, and that's the level of confidence that we have at this time on this estimate.
Okay,
If I could just really interject really quick, part of why we started this process was because we were scoping projects to rehabilitate the existing facility and running into the exact same thing you're noticing right now. But every time we had a conversation about one of these projects, they would get more expensive. So the logic started to become, if these are going to get more and more and more and more expensive, are we throwing good money after bad? And that was the impetus behind even doing this study in the first place. So while we're focusing a little bit on the cost acceleration of the MBR project, meanwhile, Alternative Zero is also accelerating at a rate that is either equal to or greater than the MBR rate. So I agree with you completely, Director Cox. I know we don't want to see this continue to just, hey, black box magic, you know, we make stuff because it's the new information we have. But we were kind of running into that scenario with the rehab, with the existing CIP that we were looking at, and it was chasing your tail. And so that, again, that's why we kind of
and we
started.
still have this 50-year-old system.
And we still would have, yeah, exactly. I mean,
I get the whole concept. I just, like I say, a lot of this goes over my head, but when it comes to dollars and cents, at the end of the show, I want to have a figure that we can wrap our arms around, that we can sit back and find the money.
I think the problem here is just that it could be 30% lower or 25% higher. That's a 55% spread. That's a lot. Yeah, it's hard to sit here and go, "Ooh, let's go."
Well, that's what every utility feels.
Yeah, I get it.
Yeah.
Gotta bite it off and pray.
So Ricky, one of the things that I keep going back to, and Dale, I'm probably not 95%, but I'm not far away from it. The annual savings of this, when you project it out, and it's like 1.2 million a year, or whatever, project that out 15 years, you project that, it starts to become a pretty big number, right? 20 million before you know it, 30 million before you know it.
It's about 2.6 million in operational cost savings year after year.
Right. And so looking at that and then looking at a system that sets us up much better for future requirements, those are two things that it's part of my thought process. And I know that we can go into it a little bit more as we move on. But I look at it from an efficiency standpoint, right? Everybody knows what efficiency is doing right now. Well, guess what? 20 years down the road, we're going to have an efficient, if we go MBR, we're going to have a very efficient system that allows us to handle regulations that might come down the pipe. If we do the R&R, it's going to be what we've been doing for 50 years. And we may not be set up.
I think doing an R&R is even part of the equation. I think that it's time for us to move to the 21st century. And this is 21st century. Where I'm coming from is, at the end of the day, I'd like to sit back and have a concrete number that we know what we're dealing with, and we're on the right track here.
You won't really know till you bid the project and the economy,
Right.
but again, we're gonna see in the next item, a model where you can, you know, we can do some what ifs and say, what if it is 480 million, and see what that would do to our rates. And I don't think we have the ability to do that.
Okay.
There's also
So-
things that you can do as part of the design process. You know, I know value engineering can sometimes be a negative word for a lot of people, but that's one method of, you get to a 60% design, costs come in a bit higher than what we had anticipated. We look at where are there ways we can cut costs and save some money before we move this forward out to bid. So there's things that can be done to mitigate cost escalations, but to a certain point, right?
Okay, I'll shut up.
That's valid, very valid point. Construction schedule is the next thing I think we'll look at as part of this process. So we're looking at what we've laid out as a 6-year process for final design through completion of construction of the project. Sorry, it's a bit hard to read up there, but hopefully you have it on your screen closer to you. We're assuming a final design start date in this fall, in September of this year. So starting design September of this year, a 2-year design schedule, followed by a few months of bidding and starting construction in early 2027. It's 2027. I can't see it from here. And then a 4-year construction. And so 3 years basically to get the new facility up and running, and then about a year and a half of demolition work after that. And part of what drags the schedule out is the constraints that you have with the regional board about moving dirt and earthwork during the winter months. And so that's where those bars right there, those are those constraints, those winter work constraints that really impact what can be done during those parts of the year, which is a large part of the year. Basically half the year you have some significant constraints.
So what are the kinks in the supply chain for some of this equipment? I sat in a meeting last week and we're talking fire over 2 fire engines, and they're not even getting here for 4 freaking years. I mean, done by then.
Yeah, we haven't seen anything that significant. The longest lead items right now are electrical gear, so motor control centers, variable frequency drives. We're talking about over a year from approval of submittals. So usually that submittal review process takes about 6 months if the contractors are on their game, and then about a year or more to get the equipment on site. We're seeing recent projects I've seen about 13 months to get the electrical gear delivered after the submittal. So, and we've worked that into the schedule. This is a roll-up schedule, so it doesn't show all 115 items that are on here because it's a little bit hard to work with, but that was factored in, those lead times for that equipment and into the schedule. So there's things that can be done like pre-procurement also that can kind of mitigate some of that. Yeah. So
according to this chart, if we do our job, we're going to put a shovel in the ground the end of 2027.
Correct. Right. Beginning of 2028.
We got a lot of work to do.
I have lots of numbers to show you.
But it can be done. So, one last thing I wanted to hit on is just when we're talking about schedule, when we're talking about the new processes, the MBR facility, we're talking really a greenfield facility because we're building it in a part of the plant that hasn't really been developed yet. So, there's some considerations to consider when we're talking about greenfield versus rehab, kind of the surgical approach to fixing an existing plant. And what we've seen just from experience, obviously everyone knows broken lines cause issues, but greenfield typically is faster to build than rehab, 2 to 3 times faster is what we've seen in the industry. Less risk of unforeseen conditions that can add costs during construction. Also, risk to operations and meeting your permit during construction. That's a big risk when you're taking facilities offline to rehabilitate them, that something fails, especially with a 50-year-old facility. You take one process offline, something else fails, then you're at risk of not meeting your permit limits. And greenfield also gives you more flexibility, both during design and construction, to adapt to changes. So those are some important points when we're talking about schedule and risk. So the last module here, wanted to go through the recommendation and how we landed where we landed. So back to these 2 bubbles that we had at the beginning, fiscally responsible and reducing risk and liability. So on the fiscally responsible side, we believe that MBR is the right alternative as far as reducing your annual operating costs by about $2.6 million, reducing the capital cost by 22%, and reducing the overall life cycle cost for the facility by 25%. As far as reducing risk and liability, again, there's a lot of those. Reducing your chemical use and in volume and the hazard levels of chemicals, designing the current seismic code and making the facility more resilient to a seismic event. Best positions you to meet your future permit, especially with an MBR. That was one of the the reasons why we landed on MBR as our preferred alternative was because of the better effluent quality or the best effluent quality that you can get out of those alternatives, and so it positions you best to meet that feature if they become more stringent. Greenfield construction again reduces construction risks and better defined integrity and life expectancy of new infrastructure compared to continuing with older construction. And with that, I wanted to next present the proposed facility conceptual design. You saw this chart before. This is the existing process flow diagram of this plant. I will again say that this is a very complex plant. Not many plant process flow diagrams look like this. This is a lot of unit processes at this plant. Your new process flow diagram would look like this. So as you can see, flipping back to this one, number of processes versus the new number of processes significantly reduced. The things that are shaded back are the existing facilities that will remain. So basically your headworks facilities, your R screens, grid removal, and primary clarifiers would remain. And obviously those would still have some rehab work associated with them. But everything from the secondary process through the tertiary process through the filters, that all gets replaced by the MBR. And then we add in a phosphorus sequestration step in there on the solids handling side, sort of a belt and suspenders approach there to make sure we get those really low phosphorus limits and can get those between your digested sludge and your dewatering step that gets added in. So those are the new unit processes. And so we wanted you to be able to visualize what this facility will look like at the end. And so we took our 10% conceptual design and had our visualization team pull together some renderings, kind of an update of the rendering you have over here on the wall, to look at what this facility will look like in the future. And so the yellow shaded facilities there are your existing facilities that we modeled in here that will remain in place. So this is kind of your aerial view looking from the top. South is on the bottom, north is on the top. So looking down at the facility, this is how the things are clear. Try not to get it on TV. Yeah, it doesn't work on there. But so kind of on the bottom lower part here, this is directly across from the admin building here that we're sitting in. Across the parking lot there is the new facility, basically the new facility footprint. So fairly compact facility that having a membrane bioreactor allows you to basically be very efficient when it comes to space usage. And so that facility nestles in there right near the plant entrance. And then you can see kind of as you move past the primary clarifiers there, the 4 circles, all that open space there are the facilities that go away. And so anyway, maybe a good spot for golf or something in the future. You have that space there that opens up, and then your we still retain the emergency retention basin there is that big basin that you see there, and the ballast ponds could be utilized for additional utilization in the future. So that's kind of how we laid that out. Now I'll just go through some of the other renderings of the facility. So this is kind of looking from south at the same facility there. This would be driving in the front gate. The MBR building is that building there to the right as you drive in. This is looking inside the membrane bioreactor, the membranes, the process there, the pump gallery. This is the bioreactor, Dale, that I mentioned is uncovered, the uncovered bioreactor. So that's the only unit process that's not inside of a building. That's fairly common in the industry to have those outdoors. So we want to make appropriate provisions during design to facilitate snow removal. We're assuming that all the walkways on here are graded so that snow doesn't go up on them. But obviously there's details to work out in the final design. This is the screening facility. So one of the requirements for membranes is that you have to have finer screens ahead of them to protect the membrane. So these are finer screens than what you have in works, but a similar facility with some drum screens that would provide additional screening prior to the process. And then this is the phosphorus sequestration building that's there adjacent to your existing odor control building. And that concludes my part of the presentation here. I did have this slide here since you asked about costs. These are historical construction costs in our industry going back to 1950. But you can kind of see the cost index, how that really spiked there in 2020 significantly compared to historical. And so that's where, you know, a lot of the industry was really blindsided by some of this crazy increase. And then we've seen that kind of stabilize now over the past few years where we're not seeing such crazy spikes, but there's a lot of uncertainty now, so I'm not sure what that might look like moving forward here over the next 5 to 10 years. But
I have a question for management. So how does the pollutants factor coming out of the pipe change from there to when it gets to where it goes through the permit?
So there's a few. So effectively, the plant was designed to take advantage of some biological and chemical stuff that happens in an aquifer naturally. They kind of stumbled upon this spot. I've heard the geologist that was on staff for this said that in his 60 years ago, they never found someplace that's permeable. It's a really good find. And so effectively what happens is there's chemical processes that binds the phosphorus material to the soil or forms insoluble precipitants. So that's how it sequesters the phosphorus. And that process, what'll happen over a very, very long period of time is the soils will become saturated. Right now, we're in the process of completing that study that should give us an indicator of how long we have. Early indications are a long time. The other process is nitrogen removal, which is biological, which assuming pH, organic carbon, a few other constituents all remain consistent, right. The field doesn't show any signs of changing its ability to denitrify, which we take advantage of right now.
So at the pipe, we're not at permit level currently.
Right. Not all the time.
For some constituents, we are actually monitoring at the end of the pipe cycle. Right. So then at the river, we're down 20%, 30%. How?
It's different for different constituents. I think we see a more effective reduction in phosphorus than we see in nitrogen, but nitrogen and historically because the plant has changed the way that it operates so many times over 40 years.
That's fair.
And there was a period of time that because the field was operating so efficiently, the management at the time was actually getting permission from the regional board to bypass our existing nitrogen removal facility, send it right into the SAT because it was so efficient at treating that. A lot of that stuff stopped in 2008-ish. There's a lot of theories why. We've even had some really, really high-level scholarly folks come out and try and make guesses at why, but it's not as efficient as it used to be. So that's what Ricky had alluded to, a little bit of the black box nature of the SAT. When they designed the facility, these limits were they were low for 1976, 77 range, but they weren't nearly as low as they are now. This has been an evolution, and I think our current limits, 2008, is when they really clamped down on it.
And then there's always for us the potential to change from the WDR, the waste discharge requirements that we're under now, to an MPDS requirement, which would also be tighter, and it actually brings most of the constituents to the end pipe or whatever endpoint is where they consider that endpoint user. So there's a lot of speculation on where that would be right now. It's going through the courts, and so a lot of unknowns for that too. So,
Do you think it could get even tighter than it is now?
yes, yeah, I do. But it's like the direction that the water quality is going, I would say that it would get more stringent than less stringent if it didn't stay.
There's, I think Blake has mentioned it a couple times, there's something called the TMDL, total mass daily load. So effectively, you say a body of water can absorb so many pounds of contaminant a day. All the people that contribute to that contaminant get a little slice of the pie, and you're allowed to discharge a certain amount of pounds. What that has happened is what that has caused is down in Tumwater in Reno, they're continuing to receive more water every year, and they're still limited to the same number of pounds of discharge, which means that they've had to lower their concentration progressively because the water's going up, but the amount of nutrients is not, or it has stayed the same. So their limits are now a little lower than ours when we do the
In Reno.
in Reno.
Okay, so, when we decided to make this decision to explore alternatives, a little over a year ago, I don't think any of us knew exactly where this was gonna end up. I want to commend Carollo and the team that was involved. Ricky, you're here, and Tim, but there were a lot of folks at those camps and on the tours. We gotta, right now, we're being asked to approve the report, what we've seen as a highlight, kind of an executive summary, but there is a bound document, a PDF that will be a part of the record that we can look back at. And, we got a lot of really good information, and again, commend staff for exploring this, because we got potentially a whole different direction now a year later. The agenda item indicates that staff is recommending that we accept the nutrient removal study. That is actionable for us at this time.
Are you looking for a motion?
I think we need a motion to accept the report.
Second.
Motion and a second. Any other comments?
Good job. Good presentations. Good job.
And I want to again thank all TTSA staff for the level of collaboration. I don't see that with a lot of clients. Just the amount of dedication to this process was really helpful.
Yeah, thanks, Ricky. And yeah, I left you guys out, but I saw that also in the field trip and in the camp sessions. This was not just the consultants who came up with the solution. This very much was a lot of input from staff, and that's great. So we've had a motion and a second. No other comments. All in favor of accepting the report, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. I did have a question. So does that conclude Carollo's current contract at this point?
We have some comments we have to finalize on the report.
Okay. I saw that, under the fiscal impact, it says a study conducted within the allocated budget. And so there's some touch up to get the final stuff done, but we're pretty much completed that and did it within budget.
Correct.
Okay, that's great. Let's move on now to the next item, which is very much related.
Yeah, very much related. So as part of the staff recommendation, we have Stephen Gortley here, who's been working with Liz to do financial modeling. Obviously, out of the study came two alternatives. Both are significant capital outlays. So with that, I'll turn it over so we can see the modeling done on how we may afford either one.
And I guess a clarification. So on this next item, it says the recommendations provide staff direction to proceed with a recommendation on how we want to move forward. So we've accepted the report, we've looked at the alternatives, now we got to give direction. What does that mean if we said, we want to go with the MBR alternative as presented? That's just there'll be a return at which I'm not sure what exactly that triggers.
Sure.
That action.
As we cover later, but I'll cover now. So the next steps really are give us direction on which direction to go, because the next step would be do a RFP for design. So if we decided to go alternative 2, it would be go ahead with the RFP for design, and the next step I think would be to refine the financial model that you're going to see today, focus solely on alternative 2.
Okay, good.
So there would be no commitment to any capital cost at this point. It'd just be further direction to proceed with RFP, which we would then bring back for approval once we know that dollar amount.
Ready? All right, brace yourselves. That'll be a lot of math. I'm going to change some of Ricky's numbers, but I'm going to explain why I changed some of them. And if you hang in there through the whole financial conversation Mr. Gortler is going to have with us, I promise a picture at the end that will simplify it and help give you an additional decision today. Fair? We're all in? Okay, we're all in. We're all in. Corolla provided a cost analysis. That's a piece to the financial puzzle. It is not the entire puzzle. As Director Cox alluded to or said straight out, the numbers keep going up. One of the things that was pointed out during Ricky's presentation was that for the cost comparison of the projects, those amounts were escalated to 2030. You hear Stephen talk about the model and our costing. We had to take it all the way out to 2059. That amount gets larger. You will see that through the numbers. So I wanted to prepare you for that. Stephen's going to talk about the cash flow impacts. He's going to introduce himself as our municipal advisor. Some of you have worked with him in the past. Some of you are new to working with him. So I wanted to make sure that he set the groundwork for what his role is here with us and what the municipal advisor does for our agency. He's going to go over a model, and I'm going to provide it to you in paper once he gets to that point. Everybody will flip through it if I give it out right now. So I'm going to hold on to that for a second. But the model does two things. It shows you what the next until 2059 looks like if you pick alternative 0 rehab versus if you pick alternative 2 MBR. And all of the things that Ricky discussed are factored into that model. In the MBR alternative, we reduced operating costs in 2033, right? So that we could take advantage of that savings and take that run rate out there. So I wanted to give you some of those guarantees that we worked diligently with those numbers from Corolla. And the escalating factors came from a Corolla model that I had as well. Let's see if there's any other notes that I want to say before I turn it over to Stephen. Oh, you will notice too, in some of the conversations and the points looking at cost analysis, we do it at a certain point in construction. We smoothed out some of those numbers. So that initial big ticket MBR, that money doesn't all happen in 1 year. We've spread it out through the model. So I've teased enough. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Stephen now, but I wanted to make sure that I touched on those points so that you knew we factor that into our analysis.
Thanks, Liz. Thanks, Steve.
I'll be back at the end.
Yeah, I mean, the Corolla analysis, it's all about cost. This is, this is about the other side of the balance sheet. How do we get the revenue to afford these costs before we make this decision? How are we going to fund this? And so.
Okay, thank you. Again, I'm Stephen Gortler. I'm a financial consultant. I work with local government agencies, primarily cities and special districts like TTSA, when they need to issue debt to finance large capital projects. It's a common thing that happens everywhere all the time. I was your consultant back in 2020, 2019 and 2020. Some of you may recall when you refinanced your SRF loan. It was a very successful transaction. You borrowed money from the state revolving fund. And interest rates were relatively low at that time, and we had a very successful refinancing of your SRF loan. You saved millions of dollars by lowering the rate on that loan, and a big part of the reason why you were successful and able to refinance your SRF loan at such low rates and save so much money was because your bond rating, you obtained a bond rating on that loan of AA, a AA bond rating back in 2020, and that really opened up the door to getting access to very favorable borrowing terms. And the reason why you got that AA rating was because you're very strong credit, very creditworthy, a very strong ability to repay your debt. Back then, that was the assessment of your creditworthiness, the AA rating. It opened up the door. We had a very successful bidding process. We got lots of bids. You got very low interest rates, less than 1%, although, in context. So, but back then, back in 2019 and 2020, and even more so today, the fact is you had very little debt, and what debt you did have was very short term. It all goes away in 2027, 2028, 2029. I forget the exact date. So very short, a little amount of debt and a very short term to maturity. And that makes it much more likely that you're going to repay your debt. It makes you much more creditworthy. The AA rating that you got back then, it was an easier achievement to get a AA rating, given that you're not borrowing that much money and you're paying it back pretty soon. But here we are, a few years later, and now what you're looking at is a gigantic amount of debt over, decades and decades. And so in order for you to get that same AA rating, which would grant you access to very favorable borrowing terms, It's a very tall hill to climb. You know, getting a AA rating in 1920, that was a piece of cake. Getting a AA rating a few years from now, when the cost of this project starts to really hit your books and you need to borrow tons of money, not so easy. And if you fail, then you're going to have a hard time financing this project. So really, my message for you is there's a few things you can do right now which will substantially improve your likelihood of success. It will position you today to be able to borrow the money you need in 3 or 4 or 5 years or whatever it happens, if you sort of prepare today for what's going to happen in the future. And they're not complicated things, but they're difficult things. A couple of them. Number one, you have to, as much as possible, you have to accumulate as much cash as you possibly can over the next 2 or 3 years and build up your reserves as much as possible so that in a few years from now, when the real cost of this project starts to come and you need to borrow a lot of money, you will have a gigantic pile of cash that will help you reduce the amount of debt that you have to borrow. You can go to the marketplace, the lenders, the investors, and tell them, you know, we need $100 million, but we've got $50 million to cover half the cost of this project. Or we've got $25 million to pay this year, another $25 million to pay next year. So we are well prepared. We have been planning for this project for the last 5 years, building up our cash so that we don't have to borrow to the hilt, so that we are prepared to use our own money to pay some of the costs of this project, borrow less. Second thing you have to do, in January of 2027, just 2 short years from now, you need to engage your rate consultant. They have to perform a rate study. You then have to, and that rate study, when they do that, that needs to incorporate the project, the cost, the timing, how much debt, when, and so forth. It has to fully reflect your capital program. Then you need to hold a new Prop 218 hearing in the spring of 2027. And then by June 30th of 2027, you need to adopt a new rate structure which reflects the cost of the project into your rates. Now, currently, your rate structure goes through fiscal year 28. You adopted a 5-year Prop 218 hearing notice a couple of years ago that carries you through 2028. You're going to have to tear that up and do a whole new Prop 218 notice period before the end of the existing 5-year period. The 5th year of the current rate structure, it only has your rates going up by 3.4%. You're going to have to do a way bigger rate increase than 3.4% in fiscal year 28. I'm guessing probably 20 to 25%. You know, we'll show you the model and all the numbers and all the cash flows and the debt and the rates and all that other stuff. You know, show you the numbers. But suffice it to say, you need to build up your cash. You know, when you talk about selling non-essential assets in order to raise cash to reduce your debt, I mean, that is like music to my ears. You know, you should be doing that yesterday and as much as possible. You know, the idea that you're going to borrow the money to pay for this project is a possibility, but there's no guarantees. I mean, you may get to the water's edge and then you may not get there. Unless you prepare now for what's going to happen a few years from now, it's going to be too late. If you're flat-footed 3 years from now, it's going to be too late. So that's really why I'm here, is to kind of tell you that yes, you can succeed, but it's going to require that you do some things now. In particular, on the first point, don't spend any of your money, build up your cash. According to the numbers that I've looked at, you have like $50 million worth of capital outlays between this year, next year, and the following year. If you go down this path, this project, $50 million. You cannot spend your money on that $50 million. To be honest, you need to be borrowing $50 million today, using that to pay all your capital outlays this year, next year, and the following year, and save all that money. Build up your balance sheet so that 3 years from now, when the bills come due, you'll have that big pile of cash. Nothing impresses investors or rating analysts or lenders more than a lot of money in the bank. You know, it's just like any other situation where you want to borrow money. They lend money to people who don't need the money. So, and you could save yourselves an enormous amount of interest cost by preparing yourself now to get that AA rating three or 4 years from now. So, I mean, the other part of this was to show you some cash flows and some numbers to kind of illustrate what these numbers might look like if you go down a certain path, we can do that unless you have questions.
Just want to make sure I heard what you said properly. So from a rating standpoint, we're better off having $50 million of cash in the bank and $50 million worth of debt because we haven't spent that cash if we elect to still go ahead and implement those projects, as compared to having less cash in the bank and no debt.
Yeah, it sounds a little bit, kind of like conflicting perhaps, but yes, exactly correct.
Okay.
If you go hat in hand and say, we're broke, we need $100 million to build this project, that is not credible. If you go and say, we've got $100 million in the bank and we need $200 million, and you happen to have $50 million worth of debt on your books, nobody cares. As long as you've got rates in place that can pay the debt service on the existing and the proposed new debt, as long as you've got the ability to repay the debt, nobody cares how much you have on the, on debt in, that you already have in debt.
Okay.
So yeah, it does sound a little bit perverted perhaps, but that's the way it works. You need, and you should not allow your cash to dip down. They look at the history, not just how much you have in the bank today, but how much did you have in the bank last year, the year before, the year before, and the year before. You need a track record of maintaining a strong cash balance. That shows strong management. That shows good governance. Those are the things that they're going to be looking at.
Thanks.
You do rehab first, that's the one I put on top. Do the rehab version, alternate zero, do you have a copy?
Please.
I think I should do it. I think we're gonna be zero blurry-eyed by the time we're done. Rehab, that the MBR is gonna be, what the hell's this?
Fair point, everyone swap your papers, I put rehab on the top. So make sure you're looking at the top, that's labeled MBR.
Suggestion.
We'll do MBR first?
Yeah, in the upper left-hand corner that says MBR.
Wow, this is stunning. I hadn't seen this before. This is printed version.
Have you seen the model, you guys? It was just the size of the paper that was.
So you can see it's 3 pages. This is the NBR scenario. In the first page, it's 12 years. It goes out to 2036. Second page, 2048. The third page goes out to 2059, which is the last year in the scenario. I would just, for the moment, I would just skip to the third page for just a moment and look on the far right-hand side. On that one column where there's only 3 numbers in that column, 625, 330, and 295, just to give you a little bit of a preview. The way this model is set up, we calculate that you've got, between now and 2059, you've got $625 million worth of capital outlays that you're going to have to finance through cash or debt between now and 2059, given all the assumptions and the estimates that we've been provided by Carollo, and some of the other things that we've been incorporating.
I also want to add that there is inclusive of other projects that are outside of the 2021 master plan. The 2021 master plan that Carollo provided back then has been escalated. Some of the projects have been taken a look at and revisited to make sure they have more accurate costs. But we also have a SCADA master plan. We have equipment that we have to buy. So in some of the years, you'll see a flat $5 million. That accounts for all of those other items. But I don't want anyone to take away that one of these projects is now costing $600+ million. There's other projects in that.
Right, and realizing, of course, that these are estimates. Tomorrow the numbers will go up, and then on Friday they can go down, and so on and so forth. But just to give you a sense, $625 million. Out of that $625 million, we're assuming or calculating or estimating that $330 million, a little more than half of that, can be paid from your operating cash flow, from your revenues. And the balance, $285 million, we are calculating that you have to finance that from debt. So just to give you a sense of perspective, over the next 34 years, I guess, we're looking at basically a 50-50 split, call it, between debt and cash. For the capital program. So now if you go back, just sort of set the stage a little bit. Yeah.
Real quick on that $330 million gap, the gap between those, does that take into account us increasing rate fees and connection fees?
It does.
Okay.
Yeah, it does. The revenues that will be used to pay for the capital outlays The model includes, I'll show you the assumptions that go into all of that. So back on the first page, row 1, sewer service charge. That's just simply the charges per EDU. You can see the 472, the 536, and the 582 up top for 25, 26, and 27. Those are the numbers that were incorporated into your Prop 218 notice that you did a couple of years ago. They're kind of already baked into the system, if you will. If you look at 2028, though, that $728 figure per EDU, that's a 25% increase. That's the first year of the new rate structure, and you know, I'm calculating that you'll need a 25% rate increase in that first year in order to make all these numbers pencil. I'll go through why that might be the case.
So that annual will be divided by 12.
Pardon?
That annual number, say 941, we divide by 12 to get the monthly.
Yeah, the 728 is on the tax bill. It's payable in 2 installments in December and April. You get your payments in January and May probably. But on a monthly basis, it's 112.
Okay.
Right. So you can see, just for illustration purposes, you can see, you know, the model that we use to calculate all these things, a 25% increase per EDU in 28, another 15% increase the following year. And then it kind of levels off. You know, we kind of bounce around between 2 and 4 and 0 and so forth. And we'll get to the other pages later on. But you can see the big initial rate increases are followed by more modest increases down the road. Then, you know, you can see there's the number of EDUs. We're assuming that there'll be some growth in the number of EDUs, but not dramatic growth. You know, we try to be conservative in the way we calculate these things. So we're guessing there's only going to be 200 new EDUs per year over the life of the forecast, generating some connection fees and adding to the base. And then on the connection fees, your connection fee allows you to raise the connection fee by the ENR index, which we've assumed will increase by 3% per year. Beginning next year. So there's some gradual increase in the connection fee as well. That'll generate more revenues from those 200 new EDUs each year. So you add all that together and multiply, I guess, and you come up with sewer service charges. And you can see how they escalate every year based upon the new rates and the new number of EDUs. There's your property taxes. You know, we assume that they grow a little bit every year, maybe 2% a year. That's kind of the state minimum. A little bit of interest earnings. Your connection charges, just 200 units times the connection fee, and a small amount of other revenues which we held constant. So that generates your revenue stream that you're going to generate. It starts at 28 million and it just gradually grows by the rate of increase in the number of EDUs and in the rate per EDU and so on and so forth. It's all this is a very kind of typical model that we use all over the place to show what the future might look like given these kind of basic assumptions. On the expenditure side of the ledger, you know, we just assume everything grows by 3% a year, you know, compounded annually year after year. You know, that may be high or low. You know, in some years it'll be more, some less. Hard to predict, but 3 is a fairly typical kind of assumption that people make. So that gives you your net revenues on the bottom there, row 16. That's how much money is available to pay debt service, to pay capital outlays on a pay-as-you-go basis, to save it, to add to your cash reserves. Then you've got your capital outlays on row 17. As Liz was saying, you know, we've incorporated both the amounts that Carollo have, these are the amounts that are required of the agency, irrespective of whether you do the MBR or the rehab project. This is what we're calling the baseline capital outlays that are going to be required, assuming you do one or the other, but not including those costs. And then under row 18, you can see these are the MBR numbers that we've incorporated. We're assuming that there'll be a sort of a phased-in approach to incurring these costs. $10 million in 26, $10 million in 27, and then the big expense starts to occur in 2028 and thereafter. You know, we spread it out equally over 5 years. If you add all these numbers up, they tie to the assumption that Carollo had given us as far as the total. As I mentioned earlier, you know, in January 27, you're going to do a new rate study, and that's going to incorporate the then current best estimates as to the timing and the cost. So these numbers between now and then, but by the time you get to, you know, June 30th of 2027, hopefully you'll have a much better idea or much higher confidence in what these numbers are going to look like. So then you've got your total capital outlays, the combination of the baseline plus the MBR. There's your pay-as-you-go capital outlays, and there's your bond proceeds. And this is where we sort of layered in the debt. You know, the $50 million that's showing up there as debt proceeds, it's kind of boxed. That money is actually going to be used to pay capital outlays for the rest of the current fiscal year, for all of 25-26, for all of 26-27. I think it's about 57 million is in these numbers. We're covering 50 million of that from the bond proceeds. It's just in the one column, but it's for all three. Below that, you can see there's your existing bond debt service on the 2020 refinancing that you did. Those bonds go away and are paid off at the end of fiscal 28. After that, you can see in fiscal 28 and thereafter, we have you issuing 40 million, then 45 million, then 70 million, then 50 million. So these debt amounts, the timing and the amount of these debt issuances, and you may lump them together, or you may spread them out, and so forth. They're designed to accomplish a couple of purposes. Number one, we want to make sure that on the very bottom there, where it says ending cash balance, we want to make sure that you always have roughly $50 million worth of cash. You can see we lined these things up all across so that you maintain at least $50 million on an ongoing basis. Sometimes it drops a little bit, sometimes it goes up a little bit in order to prepare for a future capital outlay, but that was one of the parameters. The other parameter is, you can see there's the row 26 debt service coverage. In order for you to be creditworthy and to borrow these amounts of money, you need to always maintain a good debt service coverage ratio. That's the net revenues divided by the annual debt service. That's a measure of your ability to repay your debt. We always want that number to be at least 1.5 times. If it falls below 1.5 times, then that's going to call into question it's not enough of a cushion to comfort investors at this level of debt. So we time the amount and the timing of the debt so that it can accommodate a good debt service coverage level, a good ending cash balance, and not require an enormous amount of rapid increases in rates, kind of abrupt increases in rates. You do a couple of rate increases early on, and then try and maintain modest rate increases throughout as much as possible. We don't want to play games with your rate structure continuously year after year, going back and raising rates too much. So, the numbers are somewhat self-explanatory, but the idea there is you're going to need to raise rates. That's going to generate enough cash flow that'll get you over the initial hump so that you can borrow the money you need at the outset. That'll give you enough cash flow to provide debt service coverage while maintaining enough cash balance, for contingencies. And we've made some assumptions here that we think are reasonable, given, what we know today.
What's the ending debt balance on 2059?
Pardon?
What's the ending debt balance at 2059?
The ending debt balance address? It's not in here. Well, these are all structured as 30-year loans. Everything is done as a 30-year loan with a level pay structure. So, I don't have it in front of me. I'm sorry.
So it'll be 30 years. So there's probably
you'll still have debt left over, but a lot of it will be gone.
60 million.
Yeah, the first piece of it will be gone. 30 years later, it'll be gone. But it's just a convention. There's nothing magic about it. But we always assume a 30-year term with level pay throughout the 30-year term.
Yeah, you're going to carry it out to at least 2080 because your last debt issuance is 2050.
Yeah. No.
Sorry, I was looking at bond proceeds. My bad. Wrong slide. Yes, I was looking at bond proceeds.
Okay.
Excuse me.
That's fine.
But most of it will be paid off.
Yeah, no, still, no, hold on.
Yeah, because this has you, it's interesting, actually, you look at the 295, but according to these numbers, you'll be done issuing debt in 2032.
Yeah, that's a problem, I think.
Everything else.
No, the debt should get issued later for some of these. The 50 million in investment in 2059, why would we issue that debt now? Why would we do that debt in 2032 when we're not going to use it for 25 years?
The money that you're borrowing so each of the annual debt issuances in 28, 29, 30, 31, and 32, that money is spent and gone that year. You need that money in that year to cover the cost of the capital improvements for the project. There's no money left over.
That's the 52 million at the end. I get it. Or the ending cash.
No. The 50. Where are you exactly?
That's okay, I see what you're telling me. That's fair,
Yeah.
that's fair.
Yeah, you're really borrowing sort of on a hand-to-mouth basis in this model. You get to a certain point in time where you've got the need to borrow that amount of money in order to pay the bills that are coming due that year. There's no borrowing money and then spending some of it and then saving some of it for a future outlay. That's not the way this is set up. Now, you can do that, borrow more than you need for this year, spend some of it next year. That may be a good approach. You know, that's an option that everybody does, you know, it's quite common. But that's not the way this is set up. This is more set up to illustrate how much do you need to borrow that year to cover that year's outlays on the project.
And I think if I could step in for a second to answer your question, the $49.6 million that we need to spend at the end of the NBR life cycle for 2059, we have cash. It's listed as pay-go for about $54 million, and then we still have cash left in the bank. So no debt issuance for that.
Yeah, that's going to come out of cash. You set it up so you have enough cash to pay that. The other thing is,
Yeah, sure. 20 years, still be fine.
And when we bring back the plan of finance, that's one thing that when I wrap up, I'll say, this is not a plan of finance. This is to show you that we stress the model and it doesn't break, right? So when we come back with that plan of finance, that will have a lot of those details and those options for the board to select from.
Yeah, and then 14% rate increases for 30 years is quite fun. That could be changed too. Yeah, I know.
Again, not a rate model, a way to get there. I would have to imagine that Sean, who does our rate modeling, from HDR, when he comes in and does this, he's not gonna like seeing zeros for some of those years. So those will get smoothed out. Again, this was to get at how do we get to that? Can we get to that cash that we need that each year to be able to afford either alternative?
When you say it doesn't break, I mean, that really is a relative term, depending on our appetite to raise rates from 472 per EDU per year within 5 years, doubling that.
Yeah.
True statement.
Yeah.
And when I say it doesn't break, I mean, you never run, the model shows that we
Right.
still are flush with cash at the
Right.
end of every year. There's no negative on the bottom line. There was when we started.
I think the only thing I would say is that, you know, the nature of these projects is that it's hard to really plan too far in advance with accuracy and precision. You know, you may get to the first year of the project, borrow $40 million, and then you may run into a problem, and it may be 2 or 3 years before you're ready to borrow again. Or you may not spend all that money because things might change. So, we tend to look at these things somewhat incrementally from 1 year to the next because plans change, costs change, design parameters might change. Now, as you get further along and you have more confidence in your ability to look a year or two ahead, you might have more confidence to borrow more sooner. Lastly, there are many different kinds of debt that are potentially suitable for a project like this. And this model doesn't speak to what type of debt might be suitable for you. It's not appropriate to really get into the details here and now, but we will take a close look and show you, here's 4 or 5 different ways of debt financing this project, any one of which might be preferable to another, depending upon how you look at them when the time comes. So there's a whole other layer of detail that you might want to consider.
And, I think it was at the last board meeting or at the end of the workshop, again, what we had been provided with Corolla was cost. This gives us an order of magnitude of what that means in terms of revenue and the rates that we're looking at. There's that 2029 rate or the 2030 rate of $850 per EDU. It's not specific, but it gives us an order of magnitude. There's going to be some tweak, but the concern I think I had going in hearing $1 billion in expenditures is that number was going to be $4,000 or a tenfold increase, not a doubling. And so it at least gives us as a board that sort of order of magnitude of what we're looking at. Is that palatable, or do we need to say we got to find a different way to go there? There's no way we can put that burden. You were talking about all the costs that the homeowners in this area are incurring from all sorts of different directions. And, now we at least have an order of magnitude of what their TTSA bill might go up to implement the MBR. And then we've got the rehab also. And so this was really valuable to me to get that order of magnitude, because I didn't know when you're talking about $1 billion, whether that number was gonna be 5 times or 10 times or 100 times that number. And there is some break point where it's like,
That would work, yeah.
we can't go out and put that type of, rate increase on our customers. It's just not reasonable. So, super, valuable to see that.
If you want to compare it to the rehab, we ran those numbers out. The big difference between the two is that in the MVR scenario, you have much higher upfront capital costs, but much lower back-end capital costs. In the rehab scenario, you've got slightly lower upfront costs, but much greater back-end capital costs. So it produces a different, kind of end result.
Right.
If you look at the third page of the rehab scenario, the very end, you look at the top there, in 2059, this kind of cash flow model produces an outcome of a tipping or a service charge per EDU of $1,415 in 2059. By contrast, the MVR scenario had you at $1,039, a 40% difference in the fee at the end of the line. And meanwhile, the cash balance at the end of that period, it's a little bit higher, just because the numbers work out that way. 96 million for the rehab versus 61 million. So you end up with a little bit more money in the bank. But from a purely financial perspective, without regards to the merits of the different, approaches, the rehab project, because of the back end capital costs, in the long run, it will raise your fees considerably more.
Have you raised $295 million in public markets? Have you personally raised $295 million in public?
I've probably done overall about $3 billion worth of debt financing
But
for
in one project, have you done $295 million?
at one time.
Yeah.
No, I don't think I've done a $295 million
Done
financing.
a couple hundred.
But I'm not suggesting you should do that either.
Right. I'm saying over this time period, you've done 55 million a year after year.
I've done that amount. Yes.
Thank you.
I tend to, advise, taking things in bite-sized chunks, and going a little bit more conservatively, when it comes to if interest rates are phenomenally low and it's a rare opportunity, or a circumstance arises where, borrowing to the hilt makes a lot of sense. Perhaps, that might be a good reason. But barring extraordinary circumstances, I could not envision, borrowing hundreds of millions of dollars at one time.
Got it.
So again, Scott and I, as part of the finance committee, were presented with these documents, put on a screen in a live Excel spreadsheet, and we did have, when I look at this, I go, are these reasonable assumptions? What if we take some more conservative assumptions? How does that sensitivity analysis impact the results? And we had them run. We didn't do a whole lot of that, but we did, make some more aggressive assumptions, particularly on the operating expenses. If inflation is higher and salaries go up and our utilities and all that go up,
Sure.
and it tweaked it a little bit. It didn't, it didn't bust the model. It didn't break the model. That next 5-year rate increase might have to go up a bit, but again, it didn't break it. And so
Interest rates might not break it.
Again, I would,
Break a lot of things.
That's all break.
This is a good one,
It's good
I
for
know we've been, you guys haven't had a lot of time to look at it, but I would encourage you to look at it and think about if there's something in here that you think is, not, that could be seriously off by something. Like you said, I guess you're talking about interest rates, the assumption that we'd be repaying the bonds at 3.75.
Yeah, it's 5.5.
The beauty of these Excel spreadsheets is throw in a 5%.
Yeah.
What does that do? I'm sure Liz and Steve could get that information back to us. I don't think we're going to try and play all those what ifs now, but if you have concerns about some of the assumptions, I encourage, we should backstop that and see how that changes. But again, it's not great news that we're doubling rates to fund this project, but again, I had concerns that it was going to be a lot worse, and we don't have benchmarks for what other folks in the Bay Area or Sacramento and are paying annually for their wastewater services, but my sense is that these are still within the range. These aren't, we're not gonna be the most expensive treatment costs for a community.
Well, under $100 a month.
It's not unreasonable given our climate, and our protection of our environment and the permit restrictions that we have. And so at the end of the day, even though Steve queued us up with some really scary thinking about having to borrow $50 million today, go back and do a rate increase, when I saw the actual rates, my heart rate came back down a little bit and said, okay, this is doable. It's not only does it not break the bank or bust at the bottom, the top line seems like something that, is not unreasonable to potentially go out to our ratepayers and, with the appropriate story and ask them to make that happen.
So the other thing I'm getting out of this, we've got this boiler replacement project. It's like a $25 million project-ish.
On here.
So I think, what's that?
I think it's in here.
Yes.
Understood.
Okay.
But I think that's where it shows the 50 million in bond proceeds in the 25, 26, 27. I think the recommendation is rather than pay for that out of cash, is to borrow money for that, to maintain our cash balance.
It's your expectation that you're going to, pursue the project. Everything is predicated on, if you think there's a good likelihood that you're going to, go forward with the project, which I don't have an opinion on, quite frankly, but if you do, whether it's the rehab or the MBR, or you find another equally costly option, if that's your expectation, then yeah, my recommendation would be build up your cash. Even at the expense of incurring debt, build up your cash now. Set your sights on starting a rate study in January of 2027. Make that, write it down in pen, on your book somewhere. And so that way, you'll keep viable the option of doing the project. That's the way I would characterize it.
Thanks.
Why should we wait till 2027 to do a rate study?
Good question. A couple of things. Number one, you're not, as I understand it, and tell me I'm wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, you're not going to actually incur the large capital outlays for the project until 2028. There's a ramp up period where, we have it as 10 million in 26, 10 million in 27, and then big money in 28. So you're really not going to need large capital outlays until 2028. So by 2027, you will be in a position to evaluate what's the cost, what's the timing, what's the implication for the cost of service, what are the rate increases that we really need to put into effect. Let's do the study, let's do the Prop 218 notice, let's adopt an ordinance and put them into effect. To do that today, it would be more of a guess in the dark. It's too soon. There's no need, and it's too soon.
What you're saying is it's too soon to start ramping up today in preparation to what we've got dealing with in the future?
Well, if you were to do a rate study today, the rate analysts wouldn't really have enough reliable information to project the timing and the cost of when those capital outlays are going to occur in order to properly model them, to incorporate the appropriate amount of debt, and to evaluate the impact on rates. So the rate analyst wouldn't be in a position today. You could raise rates today in theory, but they wouldn't be in a position to make a really informed estimate of what the proper rate adjustment should be until, I'm just guessing, I'm not an engineer, but I'm guessing that the design work that's going to occur in 26 and 27 is going to inform a much more accurate estimate of 28, 29, 30, 31, 32. So, you want the best available information. You've already got rate increases going into it, 13.6, 8.6. I think, that's probably good enough, for now. You can kind of telegraph the fact there's a rate study coming, there's rate increases coming in 28, give people a chance to digest that news. That's my approach. That's what I recommend. So.
if I can interject and add to that answer, I have already talked to Sean about some rate modeling. We're just doing some projections and doing nothing that would cause us to do a change right now, but we are starting to take a look at it. And last time you all did a 5-year Prop 218. We could do 1-year Prop 218. You don't have to do a 5-year. So when we get to some of these tighter periods as we're experiencing cash flow, right? A super heavy snowy winter, which I would hate, construction would also hate, right? But we don't know what's going to happen. So instead of always looking out that 5 years, maybe we look out 1 or 2 and we decide to keep that rate model circle going. Because as Stephen points out, as we get closer to the project and putting that shovel in the ground, we have a better idea of timing and accuracy of costing and what the environment is going to be like. I'd love to say this is the model. It's going to be just like this. But as soon as I printed it, something changed. That's just the nature of it.
Okay, so in order to have $50 million liquid, the path that we're on right now with the numbers that we have, will we get there?
If you finance the balance of your capital outlays for the next few years from debt, then, I'm telling you, you'll have $68 million next year, $57 million the following year, $53 million the following year in cash that you could then put on the table. You don't really need that much money, but you need to have that much money so that you could then use some of it to pay for capital outlays.
Yeah, he's asking a different question.
Alternatively, if you don't issue debt now and you pay for these outlays from your cash, you're going to be broke. You're not going to have any money. You're going to go to the borrowers and say, we really need $295 million because we don't have any money, and people are not going to take kindly to that.
Yeah, I think what he's asking is, with our current rate increases over the next 2 years, can we actually raise $50 million?
That's exactly what
Oh, yes, you can you have ample capacity to borrow.
In order for us to look good in the eyes of a borrower,
right now,
the path that we're on will get us there.
Yes, you can borrow that money today. You've got ample credit worthiness to borrow that money today. What we would be representing to the borrowers, to the rating agency and so forth, is that here's the plan that you are pursuing. We're going to borrow $50 million today. We're going to raise rates in 2028. We're going to do a rate study in 2027. We've got a firm on board that's doing the capital planning. You're going to explain all this to them and lay it all out for them and say, this is the path that we're on. And they'll be like, okay, that sounds like a good plan. $50 million today, we feel comfortable with that. But you're going to have to show us something more than just the plan, in 3 years when you come back for the next round of borrowing. But yeah, you're not gonna, you're gonna present your plan to the borrower, to the lenders, to the investors, and the rating agency, and say, here is our plan. We are 3 years ahead of the curve in what we're gonna do. People love that.
Okay.
And if you can sell some assets between now and then, that would really go a long way. They really attach a lot of weight to that kind of, foresight.
We're going to have, this is a good projection. We're going to obviously have more bites at this apple going forward. Again, the action before it to this point, I think it was important to see this projection was in terms of the recommendation coming from staff, which is to proceed with the MBR project. Is that correct?
So preparing an RFP for it.
Right.
Yeah, prepare an RFP for design and continue to refine the financial modeling specific to MBR instead of spending time on the rehab portion, which would include conversations with Sean, additional conversations with Stephen.
Yeah, so,
At this point,
yes.
I feel like we're at the 7th inning, and the reliever needs to come in before the closer finishes. So I'd like to show one more chart to put this in perspective.
Okay.
Now you can open the PowerPoint presentation, please. Thank you. I can do baseball analogies. I can't do football. It happens too fast. Okay, 2 colors, orange and blue. Purposely small so you can't see what the colors are at first. But I took the projected rate increases, and the idea is to look at the trend. Again, I said to you, this was not a rate model. I can't imagine a time where we're not going to have any type of rate increase going forward. So they will get smoothed out. But based on the financial model that you just looked at and Stephen went over, MBR is the orange. I'm sorry, let me get it the right way. Alternative 0 is the blue, and alternative to MBR is the orange. So you can see that with the MBR choice, your rates raise a little bit sooner, faster, but over the whole entire life cycle, look at the Blue Barn, how much higher it is at the end. And that's really because of what I call the second coming of the rehab. When you take that $150 million and you take it all the way out, it becomes about 345, almost 350. And so that's what that blue is really increasing to be able to afford. So I wanted to make sure you have this visual. In my opinion, it made everything make sense and quick for me. So I wanted to make sure you had this before you were asked to make it. Questions?
That's great.
The reliever did well.
Put a machine out there. It's really nice.
So again, the action is a direction to move forward with the MBR, but no specific, we're not, I just want to make clear, will you be coming back in the coming months with for us to approve an RFP for the proposal, or are we giving you the operation to go out and do the RFP and you're going to come back with proposals on that? What are the future actions on?
Sure. The future action that we would take is draft an RFP for design, fly the RFP, bring back those proposals to the board for approval for the design of the MBR or alternative to plan.
So it's just the design.
It's just the design.
You estimate 25 million according to Corolla.
That's using a 10% construction, the construction estimate. That's the rule of thumb.
Got it.
So at that meeting, that's when you'll actually be committing dollars to this plan.
Okay.
How long do you think that takes
The RFP,
to get in the bids?
Be ready by August.
Yeah, true.
So move.
25. And will staff, I'm curious, preparing an RFP for a design project that, I guess, Corolla's laid the groundwork with the 10% designs that would be incorporated, and their study would be incorporated into the RFP. So, is part of Corolla's scope also helping, it's it's a little bit weird if I'm sure you guys are going to be interested in that. It'll be an internal
part of their scope to
develop
the RFP.
Okay, so it'll be done.
Knowing that if anyone that we reached out to help with that, they're going to be interested in the in the design contract. So,
but right now, in-house, you anticipate being able to put together the RFP. There's not a separate.
We do, and I'll look at Jason and Scott back there.
Okay,
back to
cool.
Give me a nod as well, but
All right, so by giving this direction, we're saying put an RFP out to move forward with the design services for this project, as we're at a 10% design level, but to take it to 100%.
Correct. And obviously, as we develop the RFP, there'll be stop-in points with the board to update progress, et cetera.
All right, that's great. I heard a motion, I think, from Director Clements. I have a second.
I'll second that. Do you need a motion in a second or just direction from the board?
I think at this point we just really need direction. So we actually need a formal motion, just direction to proceed with the RFP.
All right,
the design.
Stand consensus here to move forward with that.
Great.
Okay. All right.
And then
Thanks, Steve.
And then
There's a lot of millions in there. A lot of millions.
And I think the highlight, either direction we go is a lot of millions.
Go ahead, Dan. What was your comment?
I think the other direction they were looking for is that, in terms of future financial modeling, and focus on the MBR option.
Yes.
Which I think is inherent in the direction. So
I believe so. And we'll have touch points with the finance committee and again, touch points with the development of that with the whole board.
Yes.
Okay, so you got direction. I'm going to, just given the late hour here, and I know we have a special meeting that we're going to go to after this, unless staff has some critical stuff to share, we saw your report, so I'm going to suggest that we perhaps skip the staff reports this month, unless there's something critical for you, and proceed to number 8 if there's some additional important updates for us to keep this GM recruitment going forward.
Yeah.
Okay. Looks like people are packing up. You guys involved in the NBR stuff, thank you for all your help. We're going to keep the board meeting moving.
And thank you, Stephen, for the hard work on that. And the clear presentation.
So let's move to item 8.
Yeah, so there was a request from the board, at the special meeting last week to place a agenda item on the agenda, for discussion.
Yeah,
So,
I think the direction we've given is to try and move forward with, retaining CPS.
and I believe Vicki has an update to provide on all.
Again, we're checking in on where we're at with, we had 3 proposals. We decided to use a consultant. There was a preference for CPS. We were gonna do some additional vetting of their work, and just wondering, there was a big question, do they have the capacity to kind of move forward with us? So,
I have an update.
Great.
Is that good?
yeah, thanks, Vicki.
Okay, so, as you indicated in the last special meeting, I believe about a week ago, you did request that I reach out to CPS HR, find out what their timeline would be for starting the project, the recruitment, who would lead the recruitment, and to check on their references. I've done all those things. They said they can begin the recruitment as soon as they have a signed contract with us. I have reached out to them at this point to get a contract. I've spoken with the ad hoc members, and it is our understanding from the last meeting, and I just want to verify this, that one of them can sign the contract. Is that accurate, President Treesan, or is it yourself or the general manager?
I don't hold the process up. I think
I thought it was that we were fine with the ad hoc committee kind of finalizing the consultant scope of work in conjunction with staff, and then presumably it'd be the general manager signing the contract.
Okay, good verification. We had a discussion on that, but I just wanted to make sure we all understood. So, the person that would lead the project is Pamela Derby. She also has a couple of other individuals, Travis Fox and Sean Garcia, that would be part of the project, but she would be the lead. I did call some references that they provided and received positive feedback. So again, the conversation with the ad hoc group was that we would go ahead and continue with the process to get a contract with CPS HR. Additionally, I have provided the ad hoc group with general manager job descriptions, a couple of examples of those. Specifically, and this was just random that I pulled, the North Tahoe PUD, TSD, Tahoe City PUD, South Tahoe PUD, and Union Santa. And we have associated salaries that go with all of those. At some point in the near future, the ad hoc and I will be looking at amending the general manager job description to meet the standards of the candidate profile, I suppose. Not sure in which direction or which order that will be done, but probably the GM job description first, I would imagine.
Would you be doing that, or would the consultant be doing that as far as their work scope?
I did not specifically ask them that, but I can find out.
Either way, I think works, but.
Yeah.
Okay. The candidate profile, they will definitely be doing the job description. I think I was under the impression that I would be working with the ad hoc, but again, I can check on that.
Okay.
So the third part, we had a discussion today. The current general manager, prior to his retirement, is planning on taking some leave prior to his retirement. So the ad hoc and I had a discussion about whether they wanted to discuss appointing an interim, if they wanted to have someone continuing to work out of class, how they wanted to handle that, and I'll let them give an update on that. And then just the fourth item real quick, we talked about salary. And again, we looked at the associated salaries for those 5 job descriptions that I pulled. And in order, beginning at the lowest, moving to the highest, we had TSD with an approximate max of 284,000. We had Tahoe City PUD approximate max as 296. Union Sanitary approximate max 300. North Tahoe PUD approximate max 302, and then South Tahoe PUD 316. And based on our results from our classification and compensation study that is still pending, that we will be bringing forth next month, they're recommending a 16.79% increase of the general manager's salary, which when we calculated that out, thank you, Liz, we got a salary between $244,955 and $312,631. So just wanted to.
So that's the draft classic comp information that will be in front of us in the April meeting.
Correct.
Okay.
And we could, if we did get to the point with the consultant of providing the flyer is ready to go and we're ready to post the job, we could state on that flyer that we have an anticipated increase that we believe will be between the salary range that we're expecting, but that's just an option that I'm offering that I think would be reasonable. We have done that on previous job announcements here at TPSA, but it has really been related to COLA. When we know we have a COLA upcoming, it's already been approved. We'll post the salary as it is right now, but also the anticipated.
So that gets it for like a few days away. If like the flyer is like ready and it's 3 days to the board meeting or whatever, we would just keep our powder dry probably on that. If the flyer's ready to go out like 2 weeks from now and it's going to delay us by a couple of weeks, then we might want to take that path instead.
Correct.
Okay.
So again, just offering those as options. And then I think you missed this part, Bert, but I was going to have one of you from the ad hoc just basically state whatever updates you want, of course, but intern versus working at a class, if you wanted to have that discussion. Okay.
Yeah, and currently we have, Jason has been working as assistant GM for 6 months. Are we close to that?
Very close, yeah.
Yeah. And so the thought was to keep him in position as the assistant GM under that title until we make the choice. And we want to bring that to the board to see your opinion.
As opposed to potentially naming him as interim GM or someone else. Yeah, it's kind of 6 of one, half dozen of another. I mean, yeah.
Yes, that sounds reasonable to me. I think we're moving pretty quick here. So I know, Richard, you sent me your dates. I barely had a chance to look at it. It was a little, just the format. I couldn't see a calendar view and exactly how available or unavailable you are, before your actual retirement date. So, the continuing role you're going to play up to that final date. So,
Yeah, but basically, I summarize it in as and take every Thursday until the end of June. And then the end of June would start vacation and a combination of some sick leave for some medical at Stanford. So, and then
So potentially your presence here at the agency is going to end effective July. So even though you work till August, you'll be here till the end of June on a slightly less regular basis. But
yeah,
once we hit July,
you're on vacation, we're out sick.
Out. Okay. And then the timeline that we sort of had with CPS and their calendar was 4 months from.
It was 16 weeks, if I remember.
And that was to the point where we would have someone selected, and then there's always the time lag for them to give notice and move over. And so realistically, the timeline to bring an outside person potentially on is 5 months from now. Where are we at?
We're mid-March, April, May, June,
So
July,
we're talking
August.
middle of August. So there might be a 2-month period. So I think, your guys' suggestion is good. As we move closer to that, we'll have the option potentially of depending on how things are going, of changing or making an acting position at that point.
Agreed.
But it seems a little early to make that decision right now. So really, we're gonna get them on, hopefully on contract. We've given GM direction to sign it with the ad hoc committee. You know, the next kind of touch points is gonna be advertising, you know, formalizing the job description, that needs analysis that creates the brochure and defining the salary range in there. It's possible that might come back for, given the time frame to get them on contract. Do we expect to have either a special meeting, or is that realistically probably going to be timed pretty well for happening at our April board meeting for those actions happening? Because it seems like you'd want some board action, or at least authorize the ad hoc committee to approve the job description. It seems like that should come back to the full board. And it seems like that timeline is probably reasonable, that I'd be a little surprised to see us there before.
It's gonna land just in time.
Yeah, I think so. So that would be my anticipation.
Push them to get to that time period.
I would agree also. So my expectation would be in April, hopefully we've got a action to approve the revised job description, the brochure, and a salary range that goes along with it. And then boom, it goes out the next day, and we're recruiting. You know, that's going to be tough, especially if they're doing the needs analysis. That's going to take some time from them. But great. So it's anything else that sounds really good?
Just thanks to Bert and Scott for working on that. And Vicky, she's Ziggy.
Yeah, she's killing it.
I know.
Awesome. I don't know that there was any, it was just an update in some direction there. So again, staff, I like getting your staff reports. We got another board meeting to jump into, and hopefully April we'll get the full report. Thanks. Appreciate the stuff you've included in the packet.
We like you, but
So I'm gonna.
don't want to hear from you.
So, are there any director comments?
Nope.
Okay, so we'll adjourn this meeting, and we take another quick 5 minutes, and then we're gonna go into the other meeting. I think Rochelle might have some food for us, because we're actually.
Yeah, I've got a, that I'm already late for. I mean, this is just like a 1 minute item.
What do we got here again? This is the.
Just to adopt this resolution. It's like housekeeping on the